Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. This episode is probably one of the episodes that Bensi and I have been looking forward to a lot when we started this podcast. So before we begin the presentation on the Zohar, we want to ask you, Hakham Kimche, first of all, just to tell us a little bit about yourself and your current projects.
Oh, sure. Firstly, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. It's an honor to be here. I've been following your podcast for a while, and I admire both what you are doing and also the guests that you have on. I think you have very intelligent conversations, and I recommend it to people with whom I talk. So yes, my name is J.J. Kimche. I originally, as you can tell from my accent, from London. I grew up in London, a very rabbinic family. Graduated from there, moved to Israel. I studied in Yeshivat Har Etzion for a couple of years. I spent time in Tzahal, serving in the 101st Division of Tzanchanim. I did my undergraduate degree at Shalem College, where I focused a lot both on general Western philosophy and Jewish thought, on Machshavot Yisrael, or as they prefer to call it, their Madei HaYahadut, and there's quite a bit of a difference between Machshavot Yisrael and Madei HaYahadut, but that's perhaps a topic for another time. Right now I find myself a PhD student at Harvard. I study what I generally like to call modern Jewish intellectual history. That's the ideas that were swimming around in Jewish and Christian circles about Judaism in the 18th and 19th century. Those are very important centuries where Jews, Jewish scholars, historians, textual critics started looking at the texts and traditions of Judaism, not from a religious rabbinic light, but actually from an academic light, and applying the tools of modern philology, modern textual analysis to the Jewish religion. It's a fascinating, fascinating period. And part of what I have part of what I've been studying as well during for 18th and 19th century Judaism is, of course, the reaction to Kabbalah, which brings us to where we are today, because the reception of Kabbalah and the total reorientation of the reputation of Kabbalistic texts, and specifically the Zohar, because that lies at the center of Kabbalah, that is, I think, central to the story of Wissenschaft as Judentum, to the story of 19th century Jewish intellectual history, and that's sort of that is what got me obliquely backwards into the door of Zoharic studies and medieval studies, which I spent actually quite a bit of time on in my undergraduate degree. As opposed to my other projects, I mean, I teach, I write. I have a book coming out hopefully next year, which is a translation of Shadal's Vikuach HaChochmat Kabbalah, which is very germane to our topic today. And it's a very thorough translation, and I've hopefully done a good job and with a lot of footnotes and everything. So that should be fun.
For the Chabura, you're doing that?
No. It's just myself and academic work. It's a really fun read. It's a fascinating and really deep and thorough work. And obviously, I've
notify me, please, when that comes out. I'm going to purchase it.
Absolutely.
We want to do a podcast on it. Is this what you're doing with the help of Professor Menachem Kellner, right?
So he's serving as the editor. Yeah, he's serving as the editor, which basically means he lets me just do whatever I want. And the truth is, he's been extremely helpful. He's been a wonderful second pair of eyes. I mean, without him, it'd be very difficult, because he catches things and he tells me off when he needs to tell me off, and he's a very good mentor in that regard. I'm very close, thank you, to Professor Menachem Kellner. He was my manche ishi, my personal connection on the staff, on the faculty at Shalem College. So I actually learned with him every week for 4 years at a chavruta and the Rambam with him personally. So that was a lot of fun.
What an honor! Wow.
Yeah, no, it was really a great honor. Another project I'd like to mention here, in danger while running the risk of mentioning the competition, but I've also started my own podcast, not too dissimilar from the podcast you're doing here, Judaism Demystified. Mine is called The Podcast of Jewish Ideas. We also, the idea is to invite on, serious scholars and have in-depth conversations on their particular corner of intellectual history. So far I've had people like Ariel Mays and John Levinson, and we're about to have an episode with Mark Shapiro, and we have a bunch of excellent episodes which we've just recorded lined up. So we're very excited to be launching that. And as I say, it's important to have as many good conversations as possible about Jewish ideas out there. So, I hope both of our podcasts launch and rocket, and
Amen. And actually, we were talking off camera, but there's nothing I want to see more than people like you putting out great content, putting out content that even though it seems like it's a rival to us, but it's actually not. It's actually helps us, and it's something that we want to see in the world, because there's so much bad content out there. It's balance out the world. So we really appreciate that.
And that we fully agree. Yes.
So let's get to the topic at hand, which is the Zohar. So what exactly is the Zohar? How do we define it and describe it?
Okay, this is an excellent question. Easier to start off by saying what the Zohar isn't, which is a book. This is something, it is generally known as Sefer HaZohar, and that's how it's called today. It's how it's presented today. It's printed in book form and lies on people's shelves of book, and is venerated as a holy book and treated as such. However, neither in its content nor in its historical development can it really be considered a book. So what is it? The best way I think I can describe it is a midrashic anthology. Okay, a mystical midrashic anthology, an anthology meaning a library, a collection of texts, because that's really what it is. If you open up the Zohar, what you will see, and this is true even the printed editions since it's been printed, is that it's made up of several different sections. Okay, the main section of the Zohar, it doesn't really have a name, is usually referred to as Guf HaZohar, the body of the Zohar, and that is a kind of mystical midrashic commentary on the Torah. Okay, and it goes through most of the parashiyot of Torah. Most of Sefer Dvarim, sadly, is missing, but most of the parashiyot of Torah are covered to some degree or another. And that is the largest body of work. But there are other sections in the Zohar, and each of them have, although there are common themes and common language and common motifs running through all of them, they're all a little bit different and do different things. So, for example, there are two Idrot, Idra Rabbah and Idra Zuta, in which are convocations in which Rashby, and I'll get there in a moment, but Rashby, collects all his disciples and gives messages to them or reveals certain secrets to them. Idra Zuta is a kind of a death moment, or it is the point of Rashbi's departure from the world, etc. And you also have so those, and it's all these sections, these various sections. There's a Sefer Tzniuta, and there is the Sabbat Mishpatim, and there is all sorts of other elements of the Zohar, and these are woven into each other. Sometimes sometimes actually woven into each other in the text, and sometimes printed side by side with each other. But the Zohar is made up of these various different collections, which are mentioned there. Now, the central motif of the Zohar, and this is what ties it together, is that of what is known as a chevraya. Chevraya being a mystical group, a mystical circle of seekers, of truth seekers. And at the head of this circle is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Right? Shimon Bar Yochai is a second century Tana, who's quoted in the Mishnah and quoted later in the Talmud very often. And all sorts within the Mishnah and the Talmud, there are many stories ascribed to him in which they show, he was in a cave for 12 years and he, had various revelations of various sorts. And therefore he is seen as the head of this group. But there are many disciples, including Elazar, his son, and a couple of other sages, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Achan, and a few others. And that's the central motif of the Zohar. That you have the sort of discussions, and what would happen typically is, in midrashic fashion, one of the members of the Chevraya would open up, Rabbi Lazar Patach, he would open up his, he would sort of begin a speech, begin a sort of homiletic sermon almost, and he would interweave very delicately the psukim, the biblical verses at hand, and expound upon them through motifs that run through the ideas of the Zohar, which I'm sure we'll get to in a moment. A couple other things that I want to say about the Zohar, which are important to understand first, is that it is. Sorry, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
Okay. The first thing to say is that it's also something of a novel. Okay, and this is something to understand as well, is that the characters don't just sit there, they do things. Okay, they travel, they meet people, they meet an old man, which is part of the Sabbat Mishpatim, who explains to them secrets about the laws of Mishpatim, the laws of slavery, and then they meet they meet a young kid, which is the section called the Yenuka, which they meet a kid who also again turns out to be a Kabbalistic genius and spills secrets to them. Again, of the type which of course the Zohar trades in, and again, so it has a very strong literary component. And in fact, if you look at the recent trends in Zohar scholarship, it is the literary component that is taken most seriously and that is analyzed seriously. There's a book a few years ago came out, Eitan Fishbane at the JTS, who had quite an extraordinary book on the subject, and that is one of the trends that is in which the whole field is moving towards not just a historical philological analysis of the Zohar, which is it's a very important historical artifact, but actually also looking at it in its mystical strains. There's so much to say on the Zohar. The final thing I would say about the language, the Zohar is written in Aramaic, and that's part of its charm. It's part of its sorry,
allure.
It's what? Say again?
The allure.
The allure, yes, it has high barriers of entry. It is difficult to read to a certain degree, and we can get to it later exactly which types of Aramaic and where it comes from and how old it is, etc. But the Zohar is such a work in which the language moves with it. Okay, and let me explain what I mean for a moment. Is that the big divide in 20th century philosophy is between the Anglo-American philosophy and the continental philosophy, right? And Anglo-American philosophy is generally written in such a way where the language is supposed to be as clear as possible, right? Why? Because you're studying a difficult subject, let's say metaphysics or ethics or logic or whatever it is, and therefore you want the words to describe what you are doing and what you're saying as close and as thoroughly and as clearly as humanly possible, because that will advance thought. And that's sort of the Anglo-American tradition. But the continental tradition of the French and some of the Germans is that part of philosophy is playing with the language. And therefore, these works, when you read Sartre or Ricoeur or Derrida, people like that, so they write with the assumption that the language isn't describing the game, it is part of the game. And therefore, they write in hints and allusions and double entendres and puns, and they subtly undermine what they say, and they write paradoxically and repetitively, and the language moves along with the content. It's one organism, as it were. And that's the feeling you get when you read the Zohar, which is part of its allure as well. You're entering not just a cosmos of ideas, you're also entering a cosmos in which the ideas work together with the language and create this extraordinary, all-encompassing experience, which is why this is the opinion of Arthur Green in his very interesting introduction to the Zohar, which he says that he thinks that's why they wrote it in Aramaic. In other words, they wanted to write it in a language which was sharply different to the sort of writing they would do in Hebrew, and therefore entering the Aramaic with different sounds, different syllables, and different rhythms, you're entering into a different world, both of ideas and of language together. And that's one of the things that makes studying the Zohar really something quite extraordinary.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are the major ideas that are at the heart of Kabbalah?
Okay. So the Zohar, yes. The Zohar, okay, let's place this for a moment historically, which is that the Zohar is part of the Kabbalistic tradition. Now, it's important to note at the outset that one mustn't confuse Kabbalah with mysticism. Okay, mysticism is a general phenomenon that's actually common more or less to all religions. It's difficult to imagine how you can have a religion without a mysticism, especially a monotheistic religion where you're trying to describe or commune with something transcendent and metaphysical and substantively different from everything in your experience. And therefore, mysticism is actually quite a significant element of the religion and what you're trying to get to. However, Kabbalah is something that is a very specific set of doctrines, a very specific set of ideas and concerns and motifs and themes and ideas. And that started largely in about 12th century Provence, moved across the Pyrenees into parts of Spain, into Castile and to Catalonia, different parts of Spain, different schools of Kabbalah. And the Zohar emerged. And again, I'll phrase myself very carefully because I'm sure we'll get to the authorship later. But the Zohar is published in little booklets by a rabbi in Castilla called Moshe de Leon, between the years around 1280 to 1296. Okay, it was roughly during those years that he starts publishing them in smallish pamphlets, and they start circulating among groups of mystics in Spain, elsewhere. They move over to Eretz Israel, and that's how it happens with the Zohar. And as I said before, I'm sorry to go back for a moment, but I said before, the Zohar is not a book. It's not a book, both because its themes and it's different. It's a collection, let's say about 20 or so different texts, but also it was distributed not as a book. It was distributed in small, I would say fragments almost, and later sewn together when it was printed in about the 1550s in two cities in Italy. So what you have in the early centuries are actually only these early pamphlets, and they are published let's say, to sort of just avoid the authorship question, they are written down and published by specifically one Kabbalist, as I said, from the area of Catalonia, Castilla, Castilla in Spain between about 1280 and 1296. Now, in terms of the world of ideas of the Zohar, I actually want to be charitable to the Kabbalists, which is not necessarily my general modus operandi, but I'd like to be somewhat charitable to the Kabbalists in the sense that it seems that they are occupied by the same problems that perturb all religious thinkers, and certainly all Jewish religious thinkers during the medieval period. There's a specific set of issues that seem to be at the heart of their difficulties. and to try and basically in solving them, they come up with this whole universe of ideas, which is at the center of Kabbalah and specifically the center of the Zohar. Okay, briefly, sorry that I'm making all these tangents, but before I describe the ideas, or at least some of them, we're only going to only be able to cover a portion of them. It's important to know that obviously the Zohar isn't anything like a systematic work, right? It's not a Saadia Gaon's Emunot V'Deot. It's not a treatise of any kind. It is, as I say, deceptive. It alludes to things. It is paradoxical. It hints and then takes back the hint and then goes in a different direction. Therefore, it's actually quite difficult to piece together a coherent ideology or set of ideas, and reaches us still arguing about this today. Having said that,
systematized like the Ari's literature and the Tanya and all that.
Exactly. In fact, it was a whole cottage industry in the 16th century with the Cordoveros Or Yakar and other works to systematize Kabbalah. In fact, one of the things that granted the Zohar its authority, its canonical status in the 16th century during the whole Lurianic revolution and its aftermath was not only the printing and dissemination of the Zohar, but also its systematization. They try and make a true doctrine out of the ideas. And of course, that's a whole piece of, it's a whole area of intellectual history in itself. And let's put that to one side for the moment. So what are the problems they're facing? What are the problems that are actually common to all issues, to all thinkers of the time? Okay, a few of them. The first is the problem of God. This is a strange idea, but basically the problem is that God is being both transcendent and immanent. Okay. On the one hand, we like to think of God as entirely distant, entirely other, entirely transcendent, entirely different substantively from anything that we can possibly not only imagine but describe or have any kind of relationship with, because that is perfection, and that is the God of Aristotle, and that's the God in many ways of Maimonides, and that is something which when you're striving for perfection, so you want to have God in that to describe God in that manner. The problem with that is twofold. First is that makes God very distant. Okay, it's hard to relate to such a God. How can you relate to a God of that kind of description, right? The second difficulty with that is that it doesn't seem to jive with the data that we have from the Tanakh and Chazal, right? Meaning that in Tanakh and in Chazal, God seems to do things. God seems to feel things. God seems to have a revelation. He imparts things, and therefore he can't possibly be this distant, indescribable element if he's also supposed to be a loving father, and he's also supposed to be, according to Shir HaShirim, a lover, and he's also supposed to be, a judge, and he's also supposed to be all these things. So how can you have an immanent and a transcendent God? This is an issue that plagued Jewish thinkers, Jewish philosophers across the medieval period uniformly. Yes.
The Shomer Emunim HaKadmon.
Bension's iPad. Yes, go ahead.
iPad. The Shomer Emunim HaKadmon, Rabbi Vergas, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He states this as the primary. He elaborates exactly what you just said. Good. He's defending Kabbalah, but doing first his idea of, without the system of Sfirot and Kabbalah, how do we relate to God? That is the primary point, and also the part of praying. Who are we praying to? So I'm just backing up what you say, that this is actually all found in Shomer Emunim HaKadmon.
Fantastic, good. I've read some Shomer Emunim. It's very interesting work. Yes. So yes, that's it's also interesting. It's in the form of a debate, and we can speak about that if you want. But it's okay. So that's definitely one of the issues. Another issue is the issue of revelation, or specifically the issue of the Torah. Again, there are a few issues. Let's get to that one first. The issue of the Torah. The issue of the Torah is that how is it possible to or put it this way, the Torah seems in many ways a bit of an odd book, okay? Because you think, fine, you have this divine revelation, it's supposed to be this ultimate text, which it's supposed to impart to you all the great ideas and all the great religious truths. And if you look at it, there's some very odd elements to it, right? Elements like, genealogies, lots and lots of names, and the last third of Parashat Vayishlach is all, lists of Edomite chiefs, and it also has small stories which don't seem to make so much sense and don't seem to belong there, and why are they in the Torah at all? What have these got to do with anything? Okay, fine, big stories like the Exodus from Egypt or the revelation at Sinai, fine, you need them. But what are these small stories? What are these seemingly irrelevant tangents of narrative doing there? Also, a lot of the legal literature seems odd. Why is it so important to God to offer this amount of sheep on this day and this amount of lambs on that day? There's a lot of questions that one can ask about the Torah if and when read on a pshat, on a surface level. And that's also another problem that's facing that. And hand in hand with that, of course, is the whole industry of ta'amei ha-mitzvot, finding reasons for the commandments, right? Which again is an attempt to try and make the Torah seem somewhat deeper, or at least somewhat more full of divine wisdom than it would otherwise appear on the surface. Another question, which I probably should have put before, is that of creation, okay? How do you get from A to B? How do you get from an indescribable, obscure, distant deity who is perfect in and of themselves to what we see today, which is, kind of a world, firstly, full of unbelievable multiplicity, but also a world of a lot of lack and a lot of evil and a lot of pain and difficulty, as a veil of tears. How do you get from A to B? How do you get from unity to multiplicity and from perfection to imperfection? What are the mechanisms by which that occurs? Okay, and then a few other problems as well. I mean, the whole, what are human beings here to do? What is the purpose of human beings, certainly within the religious sphere? And also, this is something I don't particularly want to touch on today because it's much too big and complex, and also I'm not fully sure I have a handle on it. But the whole problem of evil, of course, right? And this is a subject that is very strongly dealt with in some Kabbalistic works. Funnily enough, a bit less in the Zohar, but the whole notion of where does evil come from and why does God allow it to happen? What are the mechanisms for that? So there's a sort of a set of common problems: the problem of theology, the problem of creation, the problem of revelation, the problem of mitzvot, and also the problem of the human role. Okay, so that is, I think, the best background to seeing what the Kabbalistic project is fundamentally. Once again, with the caveat that it doesn't seem to be a coherent intellectual project, rather a series of overlapping and imbricated midrashim and ideas that kind of sew one into another, and a very diverse school of thought. So how do they take care of this? The first, and really the answer is one major idea, which is when broken down and when elaborated fully, covers a lot of what we're talking about. And the idea is as follows. What the Kabbalists did was they said, okay, so we're going to take the problem of theology, and we are going to therefore talk about God in two different ways. Okay, the first way is to talk about the part of God which is absolutely hidden and indescribable and unable to be captured by any thought or any words or any ideas, and that is the part they called Ein Sof. They had two words for it, Ein Sof, and they had Ayin. And that is the aspect of God that, as the Kabbalists say, let machshava tfisa be'ekla, that it is absolutely ungraspable by anything. Okay? And that's that. However, the Kabbalists then said there is another aspect, which is the more revealed aspect of God, of divinity, and that is the structure of the 10 Sephirot, the SS Sephirot. Okay, but then the SS Sephirot takes you from this indescribable, distant, absolutely transcendent entity all the way down to the physical world that we have now, and functions as a map for the relationship for divinity itself. Now, before I go on, it's something that we're not at all used to thinking about or used to hearing, but for the Kabbalists, God, or one might say divinity, or the divine dimension, isn't perfectly unified, isn't a perfect singularity like the Rambam insists. Rather, it is an ecology. Okay, it is an ecosystem. It is a realm made up of lots of different points, each of them finely balanced with each other. Okay, and that is the way through which the divine and basically, this we'll probably go on to it soon, but this is very much building off of Neoplatonic ideas and structures. But essentially, the idea is that God is not creating, but rather the word is emanating. Okay, that from within the concealed divine comes, ripples some sort of tiny point that comes forth, and that's the very first of the Sefirot. And the first of the Sefirot emanates forth another one, and then slowly another one, which go into their pattern. If you're putting this on YouTube once, perhaps you might, put the SS Sefirot chart, behind me or something like that, so people can know what I'm talking about. But essentially, that each of these Sefirot emanate one from another, and such that they constitute divine potentialities. And that the divinity is expressed through these various aspects until it reaches the physical world. Therefore, you have what I like to call a great Kabbalistic example of having your cake and eating it too. Okay, you can therefore have the transcendent divine, which is unknowable, inscrutable, and perfect. What you can also have is a facet of divinity, which is, as I say, an ecosystem. It is complex, it is finely tuned and finely balanced, and therefore can be understood, can affect change in the world, can affect creation, and can have some kind of ongoing interactive relationship with people down below. If that's how you square that particular circle. Now, this should all come with a big caveat, which is the Sepharadim are a wonderful, a wonderful map, a wonderful blueprint that is proposed by the Kabbalists. The problem is no one's quite sure exactly what it is, what it means, and how exactly it is to be defined. In fact, different Kabbalistic authors that came before and after the Zohar all have quite different ways of understanding what these Sepharadim are. And the biggest difference, and this is a sharp wedge which you can drive down the middle of medieval Kabbalah, is as follows. Are these 10 Sepharadim part of God, or are they created entities? Or
Ramak would say the former, correct?
Right. Okay, so we'll get there in a second. Yes, correct. Whereas, okay, you have, you're right. So in other words, are they, and this is how it's expressed in Hebrew, are they kelim or are they atzmut? Are they constitutive of God, or are they created by God? Okay, and this is a very important wedge issue. And the problem is that whichever side you choose, you have a big problem on your hands. Okay, and this is a bit of a tangent, but it's a great tangent, so we're going to go.
Important. It's an important tangent. Very
important tangent for the following reason. And this is, by the way, this is a very important thing. In fact, if you look at the Rabbi Avraham Abulafia, who was a fascinating 13th century Kabbalist, wrote a very sharp letter to the Rashby, Shlomo ben Aderet, who was one of the Talmud, one of the students of Nachmanides, and a Kabbalist himself. And basically, he didn't use the 10 Sepharadim, or not in the same way that others used it. And he, in fact, attacked Aderet. He attacked the Rashby and said, the Christians split God into 3, and you have split God into 10. Okay, that is the accusation that can be leveled if you say that these 10 Sepharadim are in fact constitutive of the divine, because that seems to as you say, split the divine. What do you mean God has 10 parts, 10 facets, 10 aspects? From a Maimonidean or philosophical perspective, that's absolute heresy, right? And in fact, that's what Abulafia is saying, and that's what various others have said as well. And we'll put that to one side for a moment. However, if you say they are kelim, if they are just created entities, then that's also a bit of an issue. Because what you have is, because the Kabbalists tend to pray with the kavanot in mind of these, with the intentions in mind of these 10 Sepharadim, right? So they say, this bracha, we have to think of Tiferet, and this bracha, we have to think of Chokhmah, or Binah, whatever it is, whatever the 10 Sepharadim are, and therefore it seems to be they're praying to something which isn't God, which is created by God. And that, of course, is a big no-no, especially, again, in post-Maimonidean Judaism, that is something that's absolutely, that's idolatry.
You can't reach the Ein Sof, so you have to.
Right, that's what the Kabbalists would tell you. The Kabbalists will tell you, well, what can we do? I mean, we can't even think of the Ein Sof. We can't describe the Ein Sof. And in fact, the Kabbalists go further, and they say that the names of God in the Bible do not describe the Ein Sof. The God, the infinite God, the Ayin is not mentioned at all in the Tanakh. All the Sephirot have different names. One is the Sephirah of, the name Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey. Another one is the Sephirah of Elohim. Another is the Sephirah of all the other names of God. And each of these are referred to. In fact, there's one drasha in the Zohar, I think towards the beginning, if I'm not mistaken, which says that on the pasuk Bereshit bara Elohim. What does that mean? Bereshit bara Elohim means that in the beginning Elohim was created. Yeah. Okay. In other words, the beginning, that particular Sephirah, which, if I'm not mistaken, is either Chokhmah or Binah. I can't remember exactly which one they're referring to. But in the beginning, those upper Sephirah, the Arich and Pin, were created and were emanated, and that's the real meaning of that's the real meaning of the Torah. That's the real meaning of that pasuk, Bereshit bara Elohim, and that's the real. And that's the true divine drama that's going on. And this is a very important point, which Gershom Scholem, the great Kabbalah researcher of the 20th century, referred to over and over again, which is that he sees the Kabbalah and the Zohar as the return of Jewish mythology, as a kind of, that medieval Jewish philosophy had succeeded in emptying God of any kind of personhood or any kind of human-like characteristics, and the Zohar comes back with a vengeance and puts back into the divine life a drama, a creation, a theogony, a creation of the divine, a development of the divine, a manner in which God himself emanated himself from his concealed part into his revealed part. And again, a part of tremendous drama and an erotic relationship within the SS Sefirot. And this is another very important part of the Sefirot. And after this, I'm going to take a breath and drink my water because I've been yelling for a while. Sorry, it's a natural tendency, and I can't resist. But within the 10 Sefirot, what you have is this notion that the last of the 10 Sefirot, which is called Malchut, which is known as it's also known as Shechina or Matronita or other names given to it, but it's seen as the feminine receptacle, the end point of the 10 Sefirot, where everything is drawn into, and basically the personhood in the center of the Sefirot is Tiferet. And if the Sefirot are seen as they are portrayed as the limbs of a human being, so then Yesod is the male member essentially. And when the Tiferet connect with Malchut at the beginning, that through Yesod, so that is the true harmony of the divine realm, and that's desirable, and that's that is what causes creation. So you have the sort of coursing divine light or pulsating energies within the Sephirotic system, which are collated and collected in the center, go down through Yesod, impregnate, so to speak, Malchut, and that's what allows for the whole of creation to take place, including the world we are here in today. And therefore, the Zohar reintroduces a certain amount of sexual attention and eroticism back into the divine realms. Again, if you're a philosopher, if you're a Maimonidean, your eyebrows would disappear into your hairline. God, 10 parts, a sexual life, a development of God, a drama of God's development. What is this nonsense? This is the philosophical counter reaction. But this is the world of the Kabbalah. This is the world in which that happens. That so happens that most Kabbalists would furiously deny that they are dividing God into anything but one. In other words, they are obviously original monotheists, and they would say no. Obviously, it is 10 within one whole, one unit. And in fact, they have a very arresting metaphor, which is used quite often in Kabbalistic literature, which is kishalhevet kashura begachelet, right? Which is as a flame which is connected to the embers, right? And of course, it's a very arresting metaphor because, of course, is a flame part of the embers? Well, yes and no. Meaning, it is both. It is both part of it and divorced from it. It is both its own entity and also part of it. And that is the revealed aspect of the Godhead of divinity. I just want to write down what I want to say next because I really need to pause for breath. So why don't one of you talk for 30 seconds? Give me a break.
Yeah. So I actually want you, when you mentioned the whole creation of Elohim, it actually made me remember that the Christian Kabbalists would point to the bara part of it, actually, which was Ben Ruach Abba.
Ben Ruach and Av, yes.
Yeah.
This, as far as I can tell, is the invention of a fantastic Renaissance humanist called Johannes Reuchlin, who knew a lot about Kabbalah and wrote a lot about Kabbalah. I believe it was him who first came up with Bereshit bara Elohim, which is Bereshit bara Bet Reish Aleph Ben Ruach and Av, which is of course the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And of course that's obviously a Christian, as you say, Christian reading of it. But that shows actually the weakness or vulnerability of the Kabbalistic methods of reading the Torah. Because again, if you're going to read the Torah, the Kabbalists do, through gematrias, through Rashi Tevot, through Sotfei Tevot, through the switching of letters called notarikon, through all these sorts of textual techniques, well, you're going to end up with the infinite plurality of possible readings, but that's dangerous because, again, anyone can join the party.
Anyone could just attack the language and reinterpret it to mean whatever they want. And it's extremely it's dangerous.
Extremely dangerous.
Yes. So.
Okay. Fine. I want to address very quickly a couple of other things that I mentioned, because I want to try and knock out some of the problems that I mentioned at the beginning. I want to show how the Kabbalistic system, again, you have to give them credit, even if you don't like what they say, because they do to a certain degree solve the problem. Right? In other words, if you believe in the 10 Sefirot, if you accept it, and of course for the Kabbalists, the Sefirot is something that both happened at creation, but also happening continually. There's a continual flow of divine light and divine energy into the Sefirot and between the Sefirot, and a constant moving, a constantly alive, as I say, ecosystem or ecology that constitutes the 10 Sefirot. However, and so the Kabbalists use this plan, this map of the 10 Sefirot divine interactions, and essentially read the Torah largely through this light. Okay, and what I mean is, Well, firstly, there's this wonderful passage in the Zohar, a very daring passage, in which it says, I can't remember which parsha it is, I'll have to look it up, where it says that if the Torah was simply the stories that you see that you see on the surface, what it calls the garb, which is the letters and words and meanings, the text of the Torah, if that is all the Torah is, well, we could have written a better one. Okay, it's attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We could have written a better Torah, and anyone who just learns the garment and doesn't look at the body or the soul beneath the garment, according to that same passage, has no share in the world to come. Right? That's the passage of the Zohar.
Yeah, like the text is empty. That's really like it's empty without the Kabbalistic interpretation.
Yes, yes, in other words, without the Kabbalist interpretation, it stands as just this odd sort of text unto itself, whereas with the Kabbalistic interpretation, suddenly everything bursts into life, right? And therefore you see the Torah as merely the sort of the garb and everything else below. And it's easy to interpret the Torah in that way, or so to speak, easy, because what the Kabbalists did, among other things, is ascribe to each of the 10 Sephirot all sorts of other names, months of the year, zodiac signs, forces of nature, and biblical personalities as well, right? So most famously, Avraham is Chesed, Yitzchak is Gvura, and Yaakov is Tiferet in the middle, right? And so, it's these divine midot that are, wrestling with each other in a kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, a dialectical triadic relationship. And according to the Kabbalists, that's part of the real drama that's going on within the Torah. That you think this story is just about Yaakov going to the well and pushing a rock, or Yaakov and the sheep, whatever it is. No, if you really understood what Yaakov symbolized and that sphera, and what the well symbolizes and what the sheep symbolize and this and that, then you can build the story in such a way that you understand the divine secrets beneath the text of the Torah, and that works for everything. That works for the narratives, that works for the genealogies. They have a whole way of understanding the list of the Edomite chiefs at the end of Parashat Vayishlach, which is really one of the strangest parts of the Torah. 37 psukim just detailing the descendants of Esav, which again, the Kabbalists, through using their expansive and extensive hermeneutic techniques and mapping it onto the SS Sefirot, can suddenly come up with unlimited, I would say, divine or metaphysical interpretations of these psukim, right? So that, to a certain degree, deals with the issue of the Torah. It allows for so much more extensive meaning to be invested within.
In a way, the text becomes like the klipa. In a way, it's like kind of the shell.
Yes, to use Kabbalistic language that actually became very popular through the Arizal. Yes, it comes through the klipa, something which is much more, as you say, it's seen as the shell. I think, to be honest, I think the garment is use is better, because which is the metaphor given by Rishon in the Zohar. Yeah, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, so in the Kitvei Ramban, I believe that he says that the text is empty, the pshat is empty, right? That's the lashon he uses, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
it's possible. I don't recall that point. I recall that in the Hakdama of the Ramban to the Torah says that the entire book is one long name of God.
Right. No, this would be in the Kitvei Ramban. Yeah. It's all the names of God as the introduction. But he actually, I'm almost positive that in the Kitvei Ramban there's a part where he says that the text is empty. And
this is so. Firstly, I believe, because that is a Kabbalistic position. However, this is one of the paradoxes of the Ramban. If you want, we can have another podcast about the Ramban, because the Ramban was such an expansive, firstly a genius, but also an expansive thinker, that he operated on all these levels simultaneously. That he can be taken just as a regular parshan. His parshanut to the Torah is an extraordinary work. I mean, it is a very serious work of Jewish thought just on its own, even if you discount all the times where he says al derech ha'emet, which is how he introduces a more Kabbalistic thing. Of course, the Ramban, being a real Kabbalist, never really lets on what he's done, his Kabbalistic thing, which is one of the many criticisms. We're going to get there soon. One of the many criticisms of later thinkers on the whole Kabbalistic on the whole Kabbalistic system as a whole. Now, okay, and one last thing I want to mention with this whole Sefirot and Torah thing is that the realm of the Sefirot also gives human beings an entirely new role in the world. Okay, because according to the Kabbalists, these SS Sefirot and the various Sefirot within the Sefirot and the sort of whole divine ecosystem must be finely balanced, and it depends on human activity, and it depends on people doing what they're supposed to be doing in order to maintain the fine balance. Okay, and in a way that this means that the divine realms requires human activity in order to achieve its fine balance and its rectification, its eventual tikkun, which again was a word picked up by Yitzhak Luria, the Arizal, and expanded into a whole theology. But essentially, this is a very powerful form of Ta'amei HaMitzvot. Because what it says is, you think you're redeeming a donkey, you are offering a lamb up, or you're, doing whatever it is. Actually, what you're doing by fulfilling a commandment is helping, so to speak, but partially in quotes, partially not, helping the divine, helping God, helping the divine realm. You are allowing it to maintain its balance. You're allowing it to the different parts to have the correct relationship with each other, which allows for a completion of the divine realms, which allows for the blessing of the divine to flow uninterruptedly downwards towards the earth. And it's kind of the cyclical nature of human beings do good things, and therefore that affects a tikkun in the divine realms.
The theurgical model. It's basically that it's anthropocentric, that human beings actually affect God, or we serve God in order to serve us in a way. Whereas the previous iteration was that it's a theocentric world where the world
precisely, and you can imagine how much this would annoy the philosophers, right? This above all else, I think, is what you see objections to those who write against the Kabbalah. They say, what do you mean? What are you talking about? The notion that we help God, that we affect the divine realms in any way, this, for someone like Maimonides, is not only heresy, it is the height of illogicality. Okay, it's the height of folly. What do you mean? The divine realms are perfect. God's perfect. There's nothing that human beings could add or subtract. And therefore, he has to develop his own Ta'amei HaMitzvot and his own understanding of human activity and why we have the Torah and why we have the Mitzvot. Fine. But for the Kabbalists, I sort of, just to, I think, sum up this segment, the elements of Kabbalistic ideas, I think, which are most important to get through is this dual theology of the Ein Sof and the 10 Sefirot. Also, the notion of the Torah as existing 99% beneath the garb, and that needing to map the Torah onto the 10 Sefirot, the 10 Sefirot onto the Torah, and describe the Torah as this. What is going on there is truly the key to the divine drama that is unfolding beneath the surface, and also the theurgic component, which allows human beings to partake in this divine realm. Now, I want to mention one more thing, which is, through these notions, Kabbalists redefine quite radically certain terms, and it's very important to know that they use these terms differently to everyone else. Okay, I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is the term yesh me'ayin. Okay, term yesh me'ayin, used in philosophical terms, means ex nihilo, creation ex nihilo, something from nothing. Okay, yesh me'ayin. However, when the Kabbalists say ayin, they don't, with aleph, right? Aleph yod nun ayin. They don't mean nothing. What they mean is the non-being. By which they mean is that part of God which we can't even say he exists, because that would be saying something about him. It is the concealed God, the Ein Sof, that is known as ayin. Okay, and of course, once again, this is a very common medieval trope, right? God in I think Meister Eckhart, a Christian thinker, is also called nihil, or in Latin, or nichts in German, right? This notion of calling God negation, nothingness, right? It is a strong Neoplatonic motif, or to call it by its negation. Also, of course, to some degree, Maimonidean as well, apophatic theology. And so, for the Kabbalists, when they say Bria Yesh Me'ayin, they don't mean something from nothing. They mean the development of ayin into yesh, the development of the concealed God into the 10 Sefirot, and eventually into the physical world. It is the self-actualization of ayin into yesh, which is what Kabbalists call creation, right? Completely at odds with the philosophical Maimonidean Aristotelian picture. Okay, and that is, again, they're using the same terminology, it's the same word, except when they say yesh me ayin, they mean the development of ayin into yesh, whereas the others would call it creation ex nihilo. That's one excellent example. The other excellent example is Yichud Hashem, right? Yichud Hashem, for Maimonides, for the philosophers, means declaring the oneness of God. Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That God is one, has a perfect unity, etc., etc.
One notion, one
entity, one divinity, a perfect unity. Okay.
He's not a multiplex Godhead, or there's no Partsufim or Trinity.
Correct. Exactly. I mean, yes. In the medieval times, yes, that's what it would have meant. Now, for the Kabbalists, Yichud Hashem is not a declaration; it is a set of actions. Leyached et Hashem. It is the practice of hit yachdut, of causing the divine realm to become more unified. Okay, as I said before, same words, completely opposite notion. It is a 180-degree different notion, meaning that human activity actively interferes with the divine realms, makes it better, has it closer, makes it closer together, and that's truly what the divine realms are.
So maybe you can explain briefly to the audience who isn't familiar with this concept of Shvirat HaKelim, which is the reason why we have to unify these,
Okay, the truth is that the main theology of Shvira and Tikkun is Lurianic literature.
Lurianic, yes, that's true.
And the truth is, I could give a stab at explaining it. I don't feel myself competent enough to give a comprehensive explanation, and therefore I'm going to leave that.
We have a podcast on that.
We'll take care of that. Don't worry.
Oh, good, excellent. Good. And by the way, I want you to keep what I just said in. Don't cut it out before you put this on.
Of course not.
Because it's important that everyone who delves into these ideas knows, okay, I have a competency in this area. This area, I sort of know what I'm talking about, and I can give an outline, but actually, I don't have the depth to really give a thorough presentation, therefore I'm not.
So before we move on to the next topic, I actually want to just mention what Rambam says about what we just touched on before. He says in the Moreh, those who believe that God is one, that he has many attributes, declare the unity with their lips, and assume plurality in their thoughts. This is like the doctrine of the Christians, who say that he is one and he is three, and that the three are one. Of the same character is the doctrine of those who say that God is one, but he has many attributes, and that he, with his attributes, is one. So I think that's just an important thing to put in. And now to the next part, we want to talk about the question of authorship of the Zohar.
Okay. This is a very important question. It is the question of all questions. Well, maybe not the question of all questions, but it's a question of great importance for the following reason, which is that in the Jewish tradition, we ascribe great importance to a book based upon who wrote it and in which period it was written. This is partially because of a doctrine known generally as Yeridat HaDorot, but the general assumption, which is that earlier generations or earlier strata of Jewish scholars have more authority and their texts carry more weight than later sort of generations of Jewish scholars. This is very basic to the whole Jewish religious tradition. And then the question comes up, okay, so we have the facts on the ground, which is that the pamphlets or the texts that would eventually, in centuries later, be sewn together to make the Zohar were first circulated in Spain in about the years between 1280 and 1300 by Moshe De Leon, a Kabbalist and an author there. We have some of his other works as well. However, the text itself seems to be the sayings and doings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a 2nd century sage, and his immediate circle. And the traditional claim is, which is believed by, I would say, majority of Orthodox Jews till today, is that this is in fact written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, or written by him and his disciples, because it also records his death, and that it remained underground or remained a secret, either hidden or passed down in secret for over 1,000 years, until, for whatever reason, it was revealed in the late 13th century by Moshe De Leon and others who may have contributed towards it there. Okay, so these are basically the two theories we're discussing over here. Either 2nd century, Shimon Bar Yochai and others, or about late 1200s, late 13th century, Moshe De Leon and or maybe his circle as well, which we'll deal at a later date. Now, before answering the question, I intend to give a very thorough work through of the evidence and the conclusion that I believe one more or less has to reach, is as follows. What sort of evidence are we looking at? What are the kinds of things that we are going to try and use to adjudicate this particular question, okay? And to do this, I'm going to ask the two of you. Let's say someone comes to the two of you and says, I heard from someone who I respect, who I trust, the Harry Potter series, which was written, we seem to know, by J.K. Rowling in the early 21st century, was actually written by William Shakespeare in the year 1600 and passed down in secret for 400 years and then published under the name J.K. Rowling in the early 2000s. And that's the belief, that's the tradition I hold. Now, okay, so you have this theory from someone you respect. What tools, what categories of evidence will you be looking for to adjudicate the question? Is Harry Potter written by Shakespeare in 1600 or by Rowling in 2000?
So in a few ways, I would answer this as the style of writing.
Okay, let me jot some of these down so I have the categories. Okay, so writing, let's say / language.
The mentioning of the existence of such a text by people who existed before.
Good. I would call that historical evidence. Yeah.
Who is the person who is making this claim, right? What is their background and how are they like obviously in the you're going to give the example of Kabbalah, the Kabbalists who Moshe De Leon revealed his text to, I think it was Yitzhak of Akko.
We're going to get there. Before we get
exactly.
He's saying theoretically speaking,
speaking, yeah, that's what I mean.
For a second.
That's what I mean by the person who is making such a claim. What is their credibility level?
Oh, okay, fine. That's the sort of the person themselves. Fine. Okay, so those are definitely. Yeah, go on.
I would figure that if it was written by Shakespeare, it would have to have some cultural similarities to that time.
Okay, yes. So that's under language. And also right. Cultural friendlies. I would say also. I mean,
also potential mistakes or contradictions with earlier statements that say of the author. Let's say the author said something in one place in the actual Shakespeare, and now in the new text he's saying something very different.
Yes, yes, errors and contradictions, very important. Also, I would say, just to speed the process along slightly, concepts, meaning, or I would say two types of anachronisms, intellectual anachronisms and historical anachronisms. In other words, you can have an anachronistic concept, in other words, a concept that Shakespeare shouldn't know, or there's in Harry Potter that Shakespeare wouldn't know, and so concepts and events / people / historical realia, which again, wouldn't have been known to Shakespeare in 1600, but would have been known by the early 2000s. Okay, and basically, obviously, it's very clear that the Harry Potter series, not to sort of display my own nerdness in this field for a moment, but obviously the Harry Potter series ticks every single box, right? In other words, the writing is very clearly early 2000s writing. It's not 1600 writing. It's not Shakespearean English, right? It references various historical events or things that happen. For example, you have the World Cup in it, which is of course something that never existed in 1600, or you have the Prime Minister, which of course never existed in 1600. You have good historical evidence that Rowling wrote it. I mean, we have, she wrote about the process, and everyone knew that she was writing it. Whereas with Shakespeare, we don't have any letters and we don't have any, external evidence of that sort. And basically, so yeah, we have all these four major categories plus errors, which don't really count so much here. But yes, so and therefore you can conclude very comprehensively that Harry Potter was not written 400 years ago by William Shakespeare. Rather, it was written as it seems to have been in the early 2000s by J.K. Rowling, because it ticks these boxes of categories of evidence. I want to go through these categories of evidence and basically claim that all of these categories the boxes have been ticked, and it's extremely clear that this is a late medieval text. It's a text written in the late 1200s, possibly by Moshe De Leon, and there are possible other authors involved as well, possible a whole circle. We'll get to that in a moment. But all four of these, or perhaps five of these major elements have been dealt with, or have been spoken about by previous scholars, and I think the evidence is absolutely incontrovertible in all of them. So let's start with the first. The first is language, okay? The language that the book is written in is, of course, Aramaic. Now, there is a bit of a problem if, firstly, just very simply to say Aramaic, because in the time of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the 2nd century, Aramaic was the language of the common people, and scholars wrote in Hebrew, okay? Whereas, and therefore, it wouldn't make much sense to write an esoteric work in the common language. Whereas, in the 13th century, it is the precise reverse. that the common Jew might know how to read Hebrew, but doesn't know how to read complex Aramaic, unless, again, they are a scholar and very literate, etc. And therefore, it makes sense, if you want to remove barriers of entry, to write a book in Aramaic. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and there are lots of fine philological points I'm not going to get into, but essentially, it's very clear this is a very late form of Aramaic. Not only is it a late form of Aramaic, which presupposes the Bavli and presupposes Targum Onkelos and various other texts, it is also something of a garbled Aramaic, meaning it is an Aramaic which is clearly not the primary language of the person who was writing it in, and clearly tries to make it sound as though he is writing it in an original initial language. However, it's very clear that that's obviously not the case, and therefore the lateness of the Aramaic, and also the fact that it makes several I would say errors in grammar and in syntax, very strange and sewn together feel of the Aramaic. Again, there's a lot of philological work that goes into this. That also points to a much later date of the Aramaic, an Aramaic which has other Judeo-Aramaics before it, which it is trying to put together and imbricate together into a new kind of what is called Zoharic Aramaic. Yeah.
Like also, now that we're on the topic of linguistics, but there's also Ladino words and
we're getting there. Don't jump the gun. I want to do this fairly systematically. You're 100% right. The other thing I want to say is that the Judeo-Aramaic written in there has also the feel of the medieval period, because what it also presupposes is a new philosophical terminology that had been transposed from Arabic into Hebrew by the Tibbonite family of translators. Okay, so there's a family of translators, Yehuda ibn Tibbon, Shmuel ibn Tibbon, who translated various of the classic philosophical works, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Bachia's work, what was the Halevi's works, etc. They had translated that from Arabic to Hebrew, and therefore had transposed into Hebrew various expressions and ideas or linguistic formulations which are Tibbonite introductions. Okay, and this is the 11th, 12th century. Okay, so a text which clearly reflects these newfangled, these neologisms, these new linguistic creations, which are there in the medieval period, must post-date.
Yes.
Must post-date.
You can trace it. You can see how it works.
Trace it. There's one phrase that Scholem brings up in his book is the phrase "in kol da," right, which means with all of this, or considering this, which is basically a perfect Aramaic translation of one of the expressions coined or brought into Hebrew by Ibn Tibbon. Now, okay, fine. So that's another part. What you said before as well is that includes several words taken from Romance languages. Okay. So for example, the word used throughout the Zohar for a guardian is gardin, right? Which is again a medieval Spanish word. It also very famously makes a pun in medieval Spanish, right? Where it talks about the Beit Knesset, the Bet Knesset de Le'ela, right? It says Bet Knesset de Le'ela Esh Noga. It calls it an Esh Noga, a burning flame, a conflagration. And the word Esh Noga, except it was probably pronounced Es Noga, and that's how it's in Spanish, means in medieval Spanish a synagogue. In other words, this book makes a pun in medieval Spanish, uses words from medieval Romance languages. Again, doesn't make any sense if that was written by Rashby. It makes sense only if it's written in the late 1200s. So this is, I think, on the one foot, the linguistic element, which is that it is garbled, a later garbled Aramaic, which betrays not only the ideas of medieval philosophy, which we'll get to in a moment, but just purely linguistically, expressions from the medieval period, and again, words from medieval Romance languages and words from Spanish or from other languages. Okay, then let's go to briefly the historical evidence. Now, the first part of the historical evidence, I think, is quite easy to say. Oh yeah, go on, Betsy.
I wanted to ask you, so there is, I know that Rav Kook has sort of conceded this, and there is a notion floating around by Kabbalistic apologists that these linguistical anomalies or errors or contradictions are there, but they will say that, not the entire Zohar was written by Shimon Bar Yochai, only a part of it, but rather over the generations, there was also, stuff put in. Bad way of saying it, but there was addition made to it.
Okay, 100%. So So what I would say to that, let's leave that a little bit for the end. What I want to do is make the case between the two theories, and then we can discuss so let's say we've been convinced by the case, what can be potential traditional responses? Because you're absolutely right. In fact, we talked before off camera about my ancestry, the Rabbi Jacob Emden. The Radak. I'm also a descendant of Rabbi Jacob Emden, who wrote a very important treatise.
Hashem, right?
Sorry, no, the Mitpachat Sepharadim. Mitpachat Sepharadim is a classic example of Zohar, a very sharp Zohar criticism, which also ends up on having a kind of orthodox conclusion, because again, he's a Kabbalist himself, he has to. Okay, we're going to get to that. I just want to make the case. The second part of the case is the historical part of the case. Now, the first part of the historical evidence, as we mentioned, is just the silence. Okay, you have, again, 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, between about 1,100 years from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai till the publication of the Zohar and Moshe De Leon. During that time, the Zohar or Zoharic texts, or this whole library is never mentioned or hinted to, not in the Mishnah, and not in all the Midrashim, and not in the Talmud, and not in the Gaonim, and not in the early Rishonim, and not any of the Jewish philosophers or Jewish thinkers. Nobody. The secret is 100% perfectly kept. Okay, this is difficult to believe. Right? This is in a way difficult to believe because, firstly, secrets generally don't stay secret all that long, and secondly, because again, you have to believe that basically that it was possible for these ideas to go on and on and on and never be even bubble to the surface, even obliquely, by any previous thinkers. Yeah, go ahead, Benzion. Put your hand up. You can it's your podcast. I feel like I'm back in the class.
No, I'm just, it's a habit of mine. I think that some people might say that while the book of the Zohar was never traced in anything before, the content can be, depends how you look at it, traced in Sefer Bahir, Hechalot, even Sefer Yetzirah. You mentioned the term Sfirot, even though what does that exactly mean? So are you...
100%. So firstly, okay. Again, I want to address that at the end when I consider Orthodox responses.
Apologize.
But you're right. But what I'm saying is the idea that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has a mystical book.
Correct.
Or mystical traditions from him. That's what I'm talking about. Okay? You're right. If you open the Zohar, it is a cornucopia. It's a smorgasbord of ideas taken from rabbinic sources, taken from, Hechalot literature, from the Bahir, from medieval philosophy, Jewish philosophy.
From Rambam and from Yehuda Halevi also.
I'm going to get to all that in a minute. But yes, that's another thing of the Zohar. That's another reason why we think the Zohar is so late. In other words, it pilfers perfectly from all these different other traditions, which again makes it a fun read, an interesting read. It's mind expanding, and it's to trace its intellectual roots is a fascinating journey, but it means it's also late. Okay, it cannot have been early. But one second. The other element of the historical record is, as you mentioned, for the Sefer Yuchasin. Now, what is the Sefer Yuchasin? What does it say? Sefer Yuchasin was written in the early 1500s, or rather put together by a man called Avraham Zakuto, who was a famous scholar, an astronomer, scientist, and he put together Sefer Yuchasin, which is essentially a work of history and genealogies. And in this work of history, he transcribes the diary or the sort of the records of a early 13th century Kabbalist, early 1300s, early 14th century Kabbalist called Yitzchak Demin Akko, Isaac of Akko. Okay. Now, Isaac of Akko writes as follows. I'm just going to sort of tell you offhand what he writes, and we'll consider the evidence in a second. Isaac of Akko says the following. He says that he was in Eretz Israel, where he lives, and people start talking about this book, the Zohar, or rather these elements or these, booklets or bits of text that are called then the Zohar. Now, he writes that some people that he talks to said, you know what this is? This is the book from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it's authentic and it's wonderful, and this is an extraordinary find. This is an incredible new discovery that we had. And other people he talks to says, no, this is recently written. This is new. Rabbi Shimon never wrote anything of the sort. And he says that he met these two reactions in Eretz Israel, which, by the way, is interesting evidence on and of itself of early Zohar skepticism. He said, okay, so he decided he's going to travel to Spain, meet with this Rabbi Moshe De Leon, and see if he has, and basically see what the story is there. So he goes and meets Moshe De Leon, and he meets Moshe De Leon. Moshe De Leon says, yes, this stuff is from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and I have been copying it out from an ancient manuscript which I have that is originally from Shimon Bar Yochai, and I have the manuscript by my house. You're welcome to come and visit. Okay, and they met not in the place where he lived. Moshe De Leon lived in a city called Avila, and so a few months later, Yitzhak de Minako actually travels to Avila, and goes, and he turns up, and Rabbi Moshe De Leon has died. Very sad. And he said, okay, this is terrible. What can I do? How am I gonna get this? How am I gonna find out? How am I gonna find this manuscript? This is the most valuable textual artifact in the world if I can find it. And so he concocts a plan with another Chacham who he meets there, whose name escapes me right now, who basically says as follows. He says, I have an idea. The Chacham says, I'm going to ask my wife to speak to Moshe De Leon's wife. They apparently were very proper in those days. I'll ask my wife to speak to Moshe De Leon's wife and say to her as follows. We will sort you out financially for life. We will pay for you, we'll pay for your children, we'll support you forever and ever. The only thing we want is this manuscript, this ancient manuscript from which your husband copied the text. Now, this is, and so what happened, so the wife relayed this information, and the wife of Moshe De Leon said, I'm sorry, the manuscript doesn't exist. He wrote it by himself, he made it all up. All of this was his own ideas completely. And then the wife says, and I accosted him, I asked him, do you really in fact have a manuscript from Shimon Bar Yochai? Let me see it. And Moshe De Leon says, no, I don't. I'm writing the whole thing by myself. And then she asked him, so why are you saying to people it's from Shimon Bar Yochai? And he says, well, it's because they won't buy it otherwise. No one will bother to purchase this. No one will take it seriously if I say it's from me, and therefore I'm going to say it's from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And the wife says, the manuscript doesn't exist, and I'm so sorry to turn down again this incredibly attractive financial package. Right? She would be set for life if she just part with this manuscript. And she said, sorry, I can't do that. This is the evidence that Avram Zakuto records from Yitzhak de Minako, who records this conversation taking place. Now, is this very good historical evidence? The answer is yes and no. Okay, it seems plausible. Yitzhak de Minako was known as a serious scholar, a serious Kabbalist. There's no reason, to my mind, to seriously doubt his diary, his records. The question is, was the wife of Rabbi Moshe De Leon telling the truth? Right? Was it in fact true that she had a conversation with her husband, and the husband said, oh, there is no manuscript, and was she in fact telling the truth? And the truth is that that's anyone's guess. Okay. Again, it seems that she had every motivation in the world to give them the manuscript. Again, she was an impoverished widow by now, and she clearly needed the money. And they were offering to set out financially for life. She says, "Sorry, the manuscript didn't exist. Moshe De Leon made it all up."
By the way, you mentioned that his daughter was also in the picture.
Correct, and his daughter confirmed. Yes.
So it's two witnesses with their women.
It is two witnesses. The daughter backed up what the mother said. Yes, that is correct. Sorry, you're right.
Isn't this story only in the Madura Rishona?
Good. It is only in the first edition printed in the early 1500s, and because it was so incendiary that it was taken out by later editors. 100%. Yes.
Censored it.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. But again, it's been revived and blah blah and found in other texts, etc.
By the way, the person who Yitzhak of Akko consulted with was David Dafan Corpo.
Yes, David Dafan, but there was another one. I think it was two people. I think it was the wife of the other person. There was two, if I recall correctly. It could be there were other ones, but again, my knowledge, my recollection of that is slightly spotty at the moment. But yes, but the main point is that we have, in terms of historical evidence. So we gave the linguistic evidence, all these indications that it's a very late Aramaic and very late language with Romance languages in it, etc. Now you have the historical evidence, which is 1100 years of complete silence on the matter. No indication anywhere, plus this evidence, this witness testimony from the Sefer Yuchasin, that Moshe De Leon's own family said that he made it up of his own bat. Okay, that is, I would say, the category of historical evidence. Now, let's move on a little bit to events or later inventions, or later what was the categories? I wrote them down, which was that hang on one second, I've lost my sticky note that I wrote my categories down on.
So linguistic, historical.
Linguistic, historical. Yes, yeah, exactly. That's the one. So where did it fall? I put it down on the desk. Anyway, I'll have to Yeah, okay, I'll have to find it later. That would have been useful to have by my side. Right, so the other is, yes, there are various events and various people, events, names, whatever it is, that come later that are mentioned in the Zohar. So the Zohar mentions, firstly, it records the opinions of various Amoraim and various members who only lived quite a bit after Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It also borrows quite heavily.
Over a century, quite a bit. It's over a century.
Yes, exactly. It also borrows from the ideas of, as you said before, Yehuda Halevi. It almost verbatim quotes a poem from Ibn Gabirol, okay, translated absolutely verbatim. It talks about the rise of Islam. It talks about the Crusades. It talks about a comet that shot across the skies of Rome in 1264, at the end of which a pope died. It describes that in very quite sort of vivid detail. It also talks about it makes no less than 9 messianic prognostications, 9 messianic predictions in the Zohar, 8 of which occur slightly after it was published. In other words, 8 of them are listed as the early 1300s, basically the first half of the 14th century, which again would be odd if why would all of Rashby's messianic predictions be right at the beginning of the 1300s? No, it makes much more sense. It was written at the beginning of the 1300s, and they're talking to the sages around it. Yes.
It's actually the messianic aspect of it is actually, you see that in Lurianic texts, because it wasn't supposed to be revealed, and the reason why it was is because there's a messianic, age that is upon us, and that's why we can reveal these secrets. That seems to be a common kind of motif.
Right. Oh yeah, I'd say so as well. And listen, my problem is not that the messianic predictions obviously didn't come true. That's actually not the point I'm making. But I mean, that is obviously a strike against the Zohar that all its messianic predictions didn't come true. But let's put that to one side. Let's say we can reinterpret those away. The point is that they all concern a very specific time of history. Okay, because that book belongs to that time of history. It concerns itself with that very specific time of history. So again, how can you try and get out of all these historical anachronisms? Well, you can say that the book was written by Rashby with prophecy in mind. Okay, what is the problem with that? The problem is that you must say that therefore it is specific. The prophecies are specific in a way that no other book in Jewish history was ever specific. In other words, you read the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, they're quite general. There will be a return. And let me describe the return in generalized, nice terms, right? And that's Yeshaya and Yirmiyah, all of these things. They have quite generalized visions of what will happen during the return or in the future. Whereas we're saying that if you say Rashby wrote it, then you have to say that he made lots and lots of very, very specific predictions about things that happened around the time of Moshe De Leon or the century or so before, and he wrote them down very specifically and falsifiably, and it just so happens that the book came out slightly after all these predictions came true. Okay, that is asking a lot to believe. Okay, so that is, I would say, the historical anachronism element to it. Okay,
even I think there's parts from the Rambam's Yesodei HaTorah, which is like verbatim.
And, yes, it quotes several. I brought the Ibn Gabirol because that really is verbatim.
But in a way that that is an argument that is very clever, because the Rambam notoriously didn't cite his sources, so they can easily say, "Oh, this is where the Rambam got it from."
Okay, so this is the counter argument we can make is, listen, all of these things, Gabirol, Yehuda Halevi, Shmuel HaNagid, it also cites verbatim an introduction of one of Shmuel HaNagid's works, the Rambam. They all got it from the Zohar. The problem is that, firstly, none of them mention the Zohar. Many of their worldviews are profoundly hostile to the Zohar. And it would mean that all of them had the Zohar in common, managed to keep it secret from them and all their disciples and disciples, until the Zohar came and published and only retrospectively revealed that all of these thinkers copied from the Zohar which they had. Again,
it's untenable.
It just doesn't add up. If
you read what they write about Shir Kolma, for example, it's like obvious that they would reject the Zohar.
Exactly. The Zohar only makes sense if it's written at the end of the 1200s. Now, there's another element to it, which is the concepts, right? Remember, I mentioned like the World Cup in Harry Potter, right? You can't have a World Cup if you're writing in 1600, right? The concept doesn't exist as a concept. There are numerous concepts. So, for example, I mean, various philosophical concepts. I mean, this is a side point, but the ideas and ideology of the Zohar are very sharply intertwined with medieval Neoplatonism and parts of Aristotelianism and the Rambam. There's a very the ideas are very strongly interwoven with the ideas that were going around at the time. So ideationally, it seems to be very much a part of that time. It also talks, for example, about Gilgul, reincarnation. That appears nowhere in the Talmud, nowhere in rabbinic literature, only first in the Gaonim. Okay. It also, and this is the real linchpin, and this again is an absolutely crucial linchpin, which is that the Zohar talks about the nekudot and the ta'amim, the vowels and cantillation marks.
They didn't exist until like the 9th century, right?
Exactly. Now, not only does the Zohar talk about it, the Zohar makes drashot from them. Okay. It actively uses them to parse meanings of words and sentences. Now, the truth is that in large parts of Jewish sort of tradition, many have claimed that the nekudot and the ta'amim, the vowels and cancellation marks, the trop, they already stem from, let's say, Ezra. Some say the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, or whatever it is. But actually, I mean, this was first really proven to a large degree by a medieval grammarian called Eliyahu Habachur, or Elijah Levita, in his work Masoret HaMasoret, the third introduction. But it's been taken on by the academic world and by many other later scholars, including Jacob Emden and others. Basically, that the Nukudot and Ta'amim did not exist until the Anshe Tiveria. The Anshe Tiveria were a group of scholars who worked, or they're generally known as the Anshe HaMasorah. Many of them were in Tiveria, some in Yerushalayim and other places, but they worked between about the 5th and the 10th century, and they're the ones who provided a whole system of Nekudot and Ta'amim to the Zohar, and that is and basically, sorry, the Nekudot and Ta'amim to the Torah. That's where we get the Aleppo Codex and all of. I mean, that's a product of the Ben Asher school of the Anshe HaMasorah. And basically, yes, and this is, again, something that was never mentioned in the Gemara, never mentioned in the Midrashim, never mentioned anywhere, and you only get it quite a few centuries post-Chazal, and yet it shows up in the Zohar. So, again, and it's worse than that, because it shows up in the Masorah in the specific Spanish version of the Ta'amim, right? Different communities had different orders, the Munach, Ravina, Pach, Bashta, Munach, Zakef, Katon, etc., etc. The Spanish rite has a very specific order, and that's the order used by the Zohar. So, once again, you have to say that if Rashby wrote it, or his immediate disciples wrote it, they must have known prophetically somehow the exact nature of the vowels and the cantillation marks, exactly how they would be passed on the Torah, and use that to basically to explain biblical verses, and use that as part of their interpretation of the Torah. Again, extremely difficult to say.
Also the fact that you mentioned briefly reincarnation, like it would make very little sense that that's not mentioned in the Talmud or Mishnah or anywhere else, and then all of a sudden it's mentioned here as a Tana saying it, but the head of the academy, which is of the Gaonim, Sadia Gaon, meaning like the Gadol Hador, right, who seemingly would know Kabbalah, quote unquote, he rejects it completely and calls it basically utter nonsense and stupidities.
So that is also part of the issue of the idea of the thing being of the Zohar being a Masorah, is that if you hold the Zohar was passed down in secret circles, you must then admit that it bypassed some of the most important scholars, such as Sadigon, such as Bachem Pekuda, such as the Rambam, such as Yehuda Halevi, because all of them have strong elements of that ideology which is contrary to the Zohar. So you must say the whole Zohar sort of bypassed them, and they either never saw it or what.
And it also goes through. But also, sorry, Benzi, but it also goes, this is important to note, it goes through the Castilian and Catalonian circles, the Franco-German circles, who don't necessarily have a direct connection to a Gaon, right? Yeah. So it's strange that it didn't go through Andalusia and
or Bavel, yeah.
Bavel, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, Benzi, go on.
Yeah, I just want to say that it's not just ideologically speaking, but Rav Sadia Gaon actually has a tshuva in Masechet Berachot, Daf Zayin, I believe, where he discusses Shir Koma. And in his discussion of Shir Koma, he actually lays out the groundwork for what could be considered part of a canon. And he says that since Shir Koma is not found in the Mishnah, is not mentioned in the Mishnah or in the Talmud, it cannot possibly be part of our canon.
Yes.
Following those guidelines, if you follow those guidelines and just reapply,
The Zohar can't be in. Of course. See, here's the thing.
He's the head of the Academy of Bavel. I mean, who is the Masorah going through if not him?
Right. I 100% agree. But the thing is, what the case that I'm trying to present here is intratextual, meaning just from the Zohar itself. I'm not even saying how the Rambam repudiated much of Kabbalistic ideology, and so did Sadi, and so many others. That's actually taken as read. I'm assuming the audience knows that. I'm just saying the text of the Zohar, all the internal evidence points absolutely inescapably to a late convert. Okay, so we talked about we've talked about historical anachronisms. We talked about language. We talked about conceptual anachronisms. We've talked about the historical record, the Sefer Yuchasin. The last thing I want to talk about are the manifest errors in the Zohar. And when I say errors, I'm taking the position that the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrashim, the exoteric literature of Chazal, is the starting point, right? That is the basis. Those are the texts we have. And if you read the Zohar, so you have a bit of a problem that that the Zohar in many ways runs afoul of Chazal in many ways. So firstly, there is various misattributions of halacha and errors of chronology. Who is after whom? So for example, it sees Rav Hamnuna Saba, who's a much later figure, as a Rebbe in the Chevraya of Shimon Bar Yochai. What else is there? There are, of course, halachot which don't appear anywhere in Shas, would appear strange. So for example, the halacha that appears in the Zohar, that someone who puts on tefillin during Chol HaMoed is chayav mitah, right? Is liable for capital punishment. That is a bizarre halacha. There's no other way to put it. That's absolutely bizarre. And of course, now, the truth is that because of the effect of the Zohar, so later communities took on this minhag, and now certainly in Israel, one doesn't generally put on tefillin chol hamoed. I still do, but the point is that it has various halachot which either are never found anywhere or contradict the halachot found in the Babli Yerushalmi. It also makes interesting errors of geography. This is what I like as well. The Zohar was clearly written by people who've never been to Eretz Israel. Okay, because firstly, they name places that didn't exist. They completely get wrong the distance between various places, either vastly overestimating or vastly underestimating it. They also describe geographical markers as wrong. They will take, a few small hills and describe it as a mighty mountain range or something like that. It is clearly an Eretz Yisrael shel ma'ala, an Eretz Yisrael that exists in their mind, that exists, from the text that they've read, but not an Eretz Yisrael they've ever actually been to or ever visited. Okay, and this is it's very, very clear. And the final thing that I suppose would be an error, and this is something which many later authorities get very annoyed about, is the deification of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai.
Yes,
something that several times in the Zohar is the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is given attributes and qualities which seem to be somewhat, as I say, almost quasi-deific, almost godlike.
He has the face. He has the face of God.
Yes, exactly. So it passes the verse. The verse says, "Shalosh pa'amim b'shana yera'eh kol zuchurcha et pnei ha'adon." 3 times a year, all your males shall see the Master, capital M. And the Zohar says, "What is pnei ha'adon? Pnei Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai." Okay. Again, this is quite astonishing. And the truth is that this kind of cult of personality around Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has lasted till this day. I don't know if it escaped your attention. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, as far as I can tell, is the only person about whom songs are written and people sing these glorifying songs. Bar Yochai nimshach da'ashrecha.
We do Eliyahu Navi also.
Sort of, but the point of Eliyahu Navi is that the song, Eliyahu Navi, Eliyahu Tishbi, Giladi, B'nheira Yavo Eleinu Mashiach Ben David. It's sort of inducing him to come already, right?
Okay.
Whereas Rishon Bar Yochai, Bar Yochai, Ashrei Moladatecha, Ashrei Ha'am, Heim Lomdecha, Ashrei Ha'om.
As if we're talking to him. It's as if we're talking to him in a way.
Yes. We don't do this for Abraham or for Moses or for David or for anyone. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has maintained this deification, and this is something that we'll get to in a moment. Presumably, Rabbi Jacob Emden thought this was. He says, "Hari zeh chiruf v'giduf." This is absolute blasphemy. Okay, so to sum up, before we move on, is I want to lay out the entirety of the case in front of you. We've mentioned, just like the Shakespeare and Harry Potter, there are a few major areas. There is the historical evidence. There is the sort of textual, the language evidence. There is the conceptual anachronisms. There are the date and place anachronisms, and there are the errors. And I think, as I presented here, with the late language of the Zohar and including the Romance language within it, and the historical evidence of the Sefer Yuchasin and the 1100 years of absolute silence, and the evidence of the many historical anachronisms, the rise of Islam and the Crusades and everything else that went on, and the conceptual anachronism that comes through the Kudot and the Ta'amim and the reincarnation, etc. And also all of these errors that I made above, it seems to me the case, and this is the punchline, that to say Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai wrote the Zohar is to say that Shakespeare wrote Harry Potter. It is historically incoherent and impossible. That is the basis that I wish to put out there, and I'm open now for any
so I want to
observations.
I think Rabbi Jacob Emden points this out in Mitpachat Sefarim, if I'm not mistaken, that one of the proofs, I think another thing that I don't know if you mentioned it, I don't remember if you mentioned it, but is that the halachic positions of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai don't line up with his statements in the Zohar.
Mentions it.
That's true as well. Yeah, that's true as well. I mentioned sort of misattribution of halacha. And the truth is that's not a field that I've looked at so much. I can't. All these the things that I mentioned are the things that I've looked into much more. Yes, there is the halachic history of the Zohar is also. I mean, exactly. The Rashby stuff doesn't line up, and of course, also more than that.
Let me ask you something.
Rashby wrote the Zohar, and if the Zohar was known, then surely the halachot in the Zohar ought to have enormous weight. And,
right.
and until it's canonized in about the 16th century, until it's printed and disseminated, it just doesn't.
Yeah, and it has an influence on halacha. Like people always say, no, Kabbalah is in a different category. It doesn't touch on Kabbalah. It's not true.
It's not true. Yes,
it's infiltrated.
Yeah, Benzi, again.
How so? It's sort of disappointing, but just to flesh out over here, also, like, okay, so it's untenable, but it caught on like wildfire, and it caught on like to essentially like a global takeover of Judaism. How did that happen? Okay, so let's get there in a few minutes. Keep that question on ice. Because what I wanted to do quickly is to take a look at maybe some of the. Okay, so let's say someone accepts my position that it's absolutely untenable. So what could they possibly say, or now what, right? In terms of being an Orthodox Jew. So there are a few ways of trying to pass this. The first is to say something like I think you said, Benzi, at the beginning, which is that, okay, look, the words, the texts that we have it as such are medieval, but the ideas filtered through, that's from Shimon Bar Yochai. Correct.
Now, again, this relies on the 1,000 years of silence, 1,000 years of non-evidence on the subject, which is uncomfortable for a historian, but I admit not impossible, because historians have to deal with what is, not what isn't. We can't adjudicate a tradition of silence or tradition of secrecy. It also is a little bit difficult because, again, as I said before, many of the ideas, the core ideas of the Zohar, are very, very much enmeshed with medieval philosophy and medieval ideas. So, for example, I mean, just modern of 10 stages of emanation. If you look in the Yosef Albo's Sefer Ikarim, he describes a Aristotelian philosophical version of a 10-stage emanation. Also, the first 4 chapters of Rambam's Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah has a 10-stage emanation. 10 stages of emanation, one after another.
The Rambam has, just for the audience, the Rambam's angel, the 10 angels, is very. Yes. It's a very different emanation because the emanation occurs in the physical world, and it's not about God. Whereas in Kabbalah, this emanation is inside the Godhead itself.
Yes, absolutely. There are differences. The point is that these very strong parallels indicate that many of the core ideas are very, very medieval. But it is not impossible for a Jew to turn around and say, look, fine, you've convinced me. Texts, medieval. However, the texts, they have in them a core of the ideas, despite the accretions that they've gathered, all the errors and all the anachronisms and all the random stories and all the deification of Rashby and the false messianic prognostications. They have the core ideas, and these core ideas do go back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and therefore the Zohar has a sort of sparks of genuineness in the center. Okay. This actually was the position of my Alter Zayda, my distant grandfather, Rabbi Jacob Emden, who wrote his Mitpachat Sefarim. And that, in fact, was his position. Again, it's not an impossible position. I will say that. The problem with that position, I would say, is that it begs a lot.
You're reaching.
No, you're reaching. And in fact, if you look at the Mitpachat Sefarim, I recommend this. Here's what Rabbi Jacob Emden does. He has a classic rabbinic introduction in which he says, the Zohar is holy, and the real true core Zohar is holy and the holiest of holies of holies. Fine. Having got that out of the way, this is sort of obligatory rabbinic throat-clearing exercise, What he then does is goes through the Zoharic corpus. And the Zohar is not so big. I mean, it's a couple thousand pages long. You can put it all in one book. Here's you can see it. This is the Kabbalah Center version of the Zohar. It's a thick book. He goes through it and he points out 282 passages which he believes are late and fraudulent. Okay, he believes there's a core of true teachings from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but that a lot of later material and accretions, including the whole of Raya Mehemna and the whole of Tikkunei Zohar and Zohar Chadash and many of those later parts, those are entirely late, but large elements which are, as you say, later, fraudulent, theologically problematic, doctrinally problematic, riddled with errors, halachic errors, etc., etc. Fine. Now again, so if you're Rabbi Jacob Emden, who's a Kabbalist, says, and you really want to hold the line and really want to try and hold into the Zohar, you say, look, despite all of this, you have at the core a true, authentic Zohar. But the truth is, that's much easier just to take Rabbi Jacob Emden to his logical conclusion. If you have a book with 282 instances of very clear, late, problematic passages, then it's much easier to say the whole book is late and the whole book is problematic. That is, it's not even a logical conclusion. It's a tiny step. Okay? Which again, and Rabbi Jacob Emden was no slouch. I mean, he's one of the most important, one of the most central rabbinic authorities of the 18th century. That gives an enormous amount of credence to that. The truth is, so that's one option. The second option. The first option is to try and say a core of a Zohar and other parts. The other thing, just to quickly mention, and this actually is, I would say, somewhat intellectually respectable, is to say, look, okay, I admit it. I admit fully that the Zohar is a medieval text, a late 1200 text. However, who is to say that Eliyahu Hanavi couldn't have appeared to Kabbalists in the late 1200s in Spain and revealed to them divine secrets? Who's to say that they didn't have mystical meditations to the point where they had a kind of a prophecy and they got divine secrets? And who's to say, and this is in fact the sort of theory of Yehuda Liebes, who's a professor, that the Chevraya, that all the figures of the circle, the Chug, are code names. So Shimon Bar Yochai is, I think, Todros Abulafia, and one of the other figures is Moshe De Leon, and there's
never heard this before,
and others. And basically, the Zohar is a coded version of actual mystical gatherings that took place in the late 1200s. But if you want to try and rescue the Zohar, say yes, all of this does betray a late reading. But who's to say a late reading is necessarily false or necessarily doctrinally or theologically irrelevant? On the contrary, maybe they succeeded in finding secrets no one had before. Again,
conveniently,
we have a canon.
Kabbalah.
We have a canon.
Yeah, well, conveniently, Kabbalah, it like you mentioned before, the Yeridat HaDorot thing, it sort of flips it on its head, because now in Kabbalah, later revelations are actually closer to, like, it's the newer revelations that matter, right? The Arizal's work kind of made the Ramak's works obsolete. So
in a way, and the Ramak systematized the Zohar to an extent that it's user friendly.
Right. So regarding that argument that they're saying that this is Moshe De Leon, this is actually a coded, this is their this is a recorded gathering used in a kind of midrashic way. So how would you respond to such a claim?
That it's implausible. That's it. Meaning meaning it's a sort of claim which, okay, I can't thoroughly disprove it. All I can say is that is firstly, as Benson said, there is a canon, meaning, you can't just arbitrarily add books. But also you can say that, look, if it's not Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, if it's Moshe De Leon, then it's much easier to dismiss. That's the problem. If it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he's a central pillar of rabbinic literature, and if he's truly the author, then the Zohar is a really important book. If it was a book made by Moshe De Leon and his helpers,
I think this is the easiest point to dismiss, actually, because
who is he? Did he write any other important pirushim that we know about? Is he such a central canonical figure? No.
I think that this is actually the part that makes it so easy to dispute, because the way this new Kabbalah that appears, it always appears in a very mysterious way, under a rock in Spain, or and then later on it becomes through a Magid, an angel, some type of all of a sudden a prophecy. It's all this new information is coming about in the non-traditional way of Rebbe to student. right?
Yes. To a certain degree.
The Mesorah has to come from that. And actually, we have what the Talmud records as Maaseh Bereshit, Maaseh Merkavah, that there's a process that it describes. Obviously, it doesn't describe true mysticism, doesn't describe God, how God functions. And also, it's kind of an oral presentation that is completely different than what we're seeing here in the Zohar.
Right. Yeah.
So for those who might be a little bit confused about a few points, I want to mention that Moshe De Leon was a professional copyist. I think that's an important thing to mention about who he was. He had access. There was no printing press. And obviously part of the success of Kabbalah and the growth of Kabbalah was the fact that there was a printing press later on, and it just exploded. But in his time, he was a professional copyist, so he had access to many texts, and he knew how to weave them together, obviously. The other thing that I wanted to mention is this style of attributing something to an ancient author is called pseudepigrapha. And it was a lot of Christians used it, some Jews used it. So it was just a style of writing, kind of to circumvent Mesorah, so to speak. That's just a way to cleverly date a text back to an ancient time. And I wanted...
Go on. Sorry? If I can comment on that very briefly, it's a very important point, the pseudepigraphic point, and that is the fault line which distinguishes 19th century Kabbalistic studies from 20th century Kabbalistic studies. In the 19th century, the major figures who addressed the dating of the Zohar was, firstly, Adolf Jelinek, an important rabbi named Adolf, which I don't think happens so much anymore, was Heinrich Gretz, was to a certain degree Christian David Ginsburg, who also wrote within that. He also addressed it quite significantly. And is anyone I'm missing? No, Gretz was the architect, the main sort of figure who addressed this. And the truth is that he, in his history, both in the text and in the footnotes, in his Geschichte der Juden, he writes very negatively about Moshe De Leon. He thinks Moshe De Leon is a forger. He commits forgery. It's fraudulent what he's doing, because he is attributing a text back to someone else, and thereby arrogating to it authority that it legitimately shouldn't have. And that was to him, to professional bibliophiles like Gretz and like Steinschneider at the time, that was the biggest insult. That was something they couldn't stand. However, this was the turning point that Gershom Scholem managed to affect in the 20th century, which he says they weren't forgers. They were practicing a very legitimate practice called pseudepigraphy. And in fact, it may have been clear to those at the time that it wasn't Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And those who understood knew that it wasn't really an ancient text. And therefore, we should see them not as forgers, but as, authors of significant texts who used a legitimate convention at the time. And therefore, we shouldn't judge them in a negative moral light. And that has basically, since Scholem has written that, basically all the research has said, okay,
the issue with that statement would be that it was known at the time, and meanwhile, according to Sefer Yuchsin, the first account already did not know that this was
absolutely very important.
And also the fact that the text was released secretly and slowly with pamphlets, and it happened just to coincide with it. And it was an anti-Maimonidean movement that happened when the fall of Andalusian rabbis. It just so happened that this text kind of slowly came through in a way to not draw the ire of the masses, because I think that if the Andalusian rabbis even saw such a thing, they would be they would have a fit.
Oh, absolutely. I fully agree, and it's true. The Zohar benefited from a lot of fortunate historical circumstances, and we're going to get to that soon. But I first want Betsy to formulate the question.
So we want to get into essentially the argument of acceptance, which means, can we get into how the Zohar became popularized?
Yes, I thought you meant by arguments of acceptance that, what can we do now that it's accepted? Meaning, the argument is the Zohar is
No, what I meant by the question is that, okay, so there will be a large chunk. In fact, most people, I think if they were listening right now, and we're talking about people that have already been in, the Zohar is ingratiated in their lives at this point, correct? So they would listen to all of this, and then they will say, listen, bottom line, after all these things that you described, it was accepted by the greatest rabbis that we had at the time, and for them, that's enough. Yes. That's what I'm trying to say. And the argument from acceptance, the argument that it was accepted, therefore, from authority or acceptance, yes, authority, it's the same idea eventually. So therefore, all these points that have been made essentially just crumble at the fact of the authorities have accepted it.
So the truth is, it depends what they're using the argument from acceptance to prove. If they're trying to say, look, all these authorities of Yosef Karo and the Ramchal and all these people accepted the Zohar and built their lives off the Zohar, and therefore we should treat it as a serious text or whatever it is. So I'm I wouldn't say amenable to it, but I understand. I mean, that is sort of the way a religious tradition works, right? And this is the same with every Jewish text. Why is the Talmud Bavli the authoritative text? The answer is because rabbis after the Talmud Bavli decided to treat it as an authoritative text, right? Well, there is a large degree of that. What I would say, though, is that doesn't change the historical argument. In other words, if you want to come to me and say, okay, and therefore, argument from acceptance, and therefore we should treat the Zohar seriously and as a holy text, an important text, fine. If you come to me and say, because it's been accepted, therefore we know that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his disciples wrote the text, that we can dismiss, again, because of what I think is the overwhelming historical evidence against it. Okay?
Gotcha.
So it depends what you're trying to do. So let's talk a little bit about the fortuitous circumstances that allows the Zohar to essentially explode. Okay, and there are a few of them. The first is, okay, so as you say, for a large period of time, it's circled among small elites within the small mystical circles within on the Iberian Peninsula. Made its way a little bit into Italy, where you had the first Italian rabbis trying essentially writing Pirushim on it, Recanati and others. The names, it's late at night, the names are starting to get mixed up in my head, but those who accepted it, 14th, 15th century Italy, and also in Eretz Yisrael and a few other places, and it started to gain some credence. Now, it must be noted that even at this early point, there were voices against it. So we saw Yitzhak de Menako's testimony already in the Sefer Yuchasin. There were several Kabbalists who didn't believe the Zohar. We also have the testimony of the Rivash, Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Sheshet, who writes in one of his tshuvot, I think number Kuf Nun Zayin, if I'm not mistaken, that he asks serious questions on the notion of praying towards or directing your kavanah towards some of the sfirot. He thinks that's bizarre, and he quotes one of the Hamid Palsafim, one of the philosophically minded Jews in this area, saying that this is basically this is idolatry, this is polytheism. And then you also have a few others. So you have the Shud Rivash. You also have an interesting testimony from a Kabbalist called Yosef ibn Wakar. Ibn Wakar was a 14th century Talmudist and Kabbalist, quite an important figure, who wrote a work, again, the name now escapes me, which has which basically is very pro-Kabbalah, and one of the sections talks about all the important Kabbalistic works that you must read, and Ramban al Torah and all the other works that you have to read. And then it says, do not read the Zohar, because it's full of errors, and it's it'll lead you down the wrong path, and it's full of mistakes, and don't waste your time with the Zohar. Okay, so we have already fragments of evidence in the 14th and 15th centuries already that this is this work is there was some sort of pushback, there was some sort of resistance to the spread of the Zohar. Then comes along Girush Sfarad, okay, the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, the expulsion, destruction of the community, and the expulsion around the world of Spanish authorities, of the great Rabbanim and the great authority figures from Spain. And that, from the point of view of the Zohar, and specifically Kabbalah, was in a way, quote unquote, very fortuitous. Because what they did was, firstly, it exploded, it made sure that all the authority figures, or those who were knowledgeable in Kabbalah and those who had elements of the Zohar, were sent to Jewish communities around the world, some around Europe, some into Italy, into the Ottoman Empire, into Eretz Yisrael, into Eastern Europe, all over the Jewish world. Secondly, the Spanish expulsion more or less spelt the death knell of Jewish philosophy. okay, of rationalist medieval Jewish philosophy, the proud tradition that started more or less with Saadia Gaon and went through, in Pakuda and the Rambam and Albo and the last gasp was probably Yitzchak Abarbanel. After that, that was more or less the end, and that had a lot to do with Girush Sfarad. So you had the major counterweight to Kabbalah and to the Zohar, more or less had a steep decline, and it's not entirely clear how or why that is, but that is certainly or what exactly the mechanism behind that was. But that's another thing that happened. A further thing that happened was that the Jews found their new environment, specifically in the Ottoman Empire and a bit later in Eastern Europe, to be much more conducive to Kabbalah than philosophy. Okay, Kabbalah, because it is, I would say, much more insular, in a way much less universalistic, much more concerned with absolute distinctions between Jews and non-Jews, absolute distinctions between men and women and other such things. These notions and concepts and ideas gained much more credence around in these new places that the Jews were. Okay, specifically the Ottoman Empire.
Also the theurgical aspect of it is attractive.
Yeah. That is theological aspect. And Gershom Scholem advanced another opinion which has been fiercely contested by Moshe Idel and others, but he also believed that there was a psychological benefit to the Kabbalistic system vastly over and above the philosophical or other competing systems. Okay, because the Kabbalistic system sees a much deeper meaning in catastrophe. Right, catastrophe is something that happens not only on the lower realm but also in the divine realm, and the Shekhinah is in exile with the Jews, and there is this, that there's a sharp correlation between what's happening to the Jews down below and what's happening in the divine realms above, and there's the way of rectifying the situation through very interventionist human actions on the part of the Jews. So you have this, and according to Shalom, that was a sort of psychological benefit which allowed for the spread of Kabbalah in the 16th century, in 1500s. That, according to him, was one of these. So it's all these various aspects which are very important. Now there are two other. So this sort of allowed Kabbalah to spread. And then two other very important factors came along. The first is the rise of Tzfat. Tzfat, very swiftly, in about the 1530s, I believe, rose as a textile manufacturing center, essentially, rose economically, and flowered an extraordinary sort of renaissance of Jewish ideas and interactions, and specifically mystical interactions. Of course, a large part of this is a return to the setting of the Zohar, right? The Zohar was written theoretically in the Galil, according to tradition. And therefore you had a return to, scholars converge on this place. And once again, they had the natural background of the Zohar, and they had the places referred to in the Zohar, and they had the graves of various, senior rabbinic leaders from the period of Chazal. And so that led to an enormous profusion of interest in Kabbalah. It had and therefore you had the systematization of Rav Moshe Cordovero and others. You had the immense expansion of Zoharic ideas from the Arizal. And you also had, and this is something you alluded to before, the seeping into the halachic system from the Kabbalah due to the works of Rav Yosef Karo. Now, prior to Rav Yosef Karo, there were several more minor halachic thinkers who already incorporated certain ideas from the Zohar, or certain customs from the Zohar. So, for example, in the 16th century, you already had the rise of Ushpizin in the Sukkah, of saying Bruch Shemay D'Mari Alma and Shul, various other customs, various other halachic decisions. Rav Yosef Karo sees the Zohar as, and quotes it explicitly as a halachic source, and integrates his Kabbalistic side and his halachic side. So within this 30 or 40 year, quite a short period in Tzfat, you have this enormous profusion of systematization, of expansion, and of inclusion within the halachic sphere, in this seething, bubbling cauldron of ideas that was 16th century Tzfat. Okay? Of course, after the 2nd century, shortly afterwards, when Tzfat sharply declined as a center of Jewish activity, you had figures like Reb Chaim Vital and others going to spread the ideas of the figures in Tzfat throughout Europe, and especially in Italy and other places, and that was the work of Chaim Vital. The other major element that led to the huge dissemination and profusion of the Kabbalah, and especially the Zohar, was, of course, the invention of the Zohar as a book, namely its printing. Okay, and it's difficult for the modern mind to imagine what an unbelievable revolution printing was, because prior to printing, writing a book was like we have writing a Sefer Torah today: painstaking, long, expensive, difficult. You have to find people who are expert in it, etc. Once you have printing, within a couple decades, you had the amount of books in the world, increased by factors we can't even imagine, because suddenly all you need is the impress of one page, and you do that page thousands of times, whatever it is, and the next page and the next page, and quite cheaply and quite quickly, you can produce as many books as you want, send them all over the world, and this was an explosion in knowledge. Of course, it's a crucial element of the Christian Reformation and later of the Enlightenment, etc., but was, of course, the revolution of the printing press. And that was a revolution for the Zohar, firstly, because the Zohar came into existence, meaning the editors in Italy, in Cremona and Mantua in the 1550s, created this book called the Zohar by sewing together and putting together all these disparate elements of the Zohar, as I mentioned before, and also printed it and disseminating it. Suddenly, communities around the world had the Zohar. And the Zohar began to be seen as a canonized text, as a text that was holy, that was belonged on the top shelf of the Jewish canon, and was treated, royally in a certain way. And of course, the ideas began to be discussed, and more works were written on the subject. And suddenly, you can have a massive explosion of super commentaries and super commentaries on the Zohar, due to, again, all the work that was going on in Tzfat, and also the ease and efficiency and cheapness that was available to the dissemination of the Zohar and Zoharic ideas, wrought on by printing.
I think also the theological aspect was attractive to people who were really suffering in a brutal exile at certain points, where it became like something like Shabtai Tzvi could have never happened under the Maimonidean tradition. It could only happen through this idea of like a new prophecy coming to some Kabbalist, right? And this, it kind of like changed Judaism forever. Really, it did, because now you have these all these offshoots, all these movements that we never had before. We never had all of these like kind of splinter groups and sects, and now all of a sudden this is just the Kabbalah kind of feeds into all of that.
100%. And I would say that connecting the expulsion from Spain to the Tzfat, to Shabtai Tzvi, and then to Hassidut, that is the major thesis at the heart of Gershom Scholem's central book, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. That is, he threads the historical loop. Now, that historical loop has been challenged by many of his successors and many later people, but he makes, I would say, a reasonably convincing case for a sort of thread of ideas, as you say, that the comfort afforded in the expansion of Arizal, and within the Arizal, the expansion of the idea of a tikkun and of a tzaddik, and that tzaddik being massively blown out of proportion in the Sabbatean revolution of the 17th century, and then quietened and defanged and domesticated by Chassidut in the 18th century. Scholem sees Chassidut as kind of Shabtai Tzvi without teeth, right? The doctrine of the tzaddik as this unique figure that can render tikkun in the upper realms, just devoid of. Scholem sees one of Chassidut's great achievements is the calming of the messianic tempers and passions which characterize the disaster of the Sabbatean movement in the mid to late 18th century.
It's more like a polemic against the after effects, the aftershocks.
Yes, yeah, which were considerable. And according to Scholem, the aftershocks of Shabtai Tzvi were to a certain degree behind Zionism and Reform Judaism and everything we see in the 19th century as well. For Scholem, and this is a tangent, but it's an interesting one, Scholem sees all of Kabbalah, this kind of mythic history, as a counter history within Jewish history itself. This kind of, major wave beneath the surface, current beneath the surface of Jewish history, that if you trace it out correctly, actually is responsible for many of the major intellectual revolutions within Jewish history at the time. It's a very interesting thesis.
I think it's very convincing, but I think if I'm not mistaken, in that book, Major Trends, he makes that connection through Sefer HaZoref, which is a book of
yes.
a Sabbatean book that
he claims that the Mesh had access to it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he didn't know it was Sabbatean and all that.
Exactly. So right. So now the truth is that the book that, if I'm not mistaken, tries to attack this is Moshe Idel's book. He wrote a book called Kabbalah: New Perspectives, Yale University Press, I think 1988. And in there, he takes down a lot of Sholem's, or attempts to take down a lot of Sholem's arguments. And basically, Scholem and Idel form the two great poles of Kabbalistic research till this day, which everyone sort of knocks back and forth.
Yeah, so for anybody who's listening hasn't heard our podcast before, you can go back to the episode we did with Professor Matt Goldish, who's going to be reappearing on our podcast, and we talked about the whole Sabbatean controversy. We also alluded to a lot of these things, and definitely there's an argument about how much did the Arizal's or Lurianic Kabbalah influence the movement. So that's really what, just to give you guys more context. But anyway, we're going off on a tangent.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the history of Kabbalah, resistance to Kabbalah, or Kabbalah criticism, specifically Zohar criticism. Just to point out a few of the major points. Now, I've talked about all the points that I've made, the counter arguments or the historical case as to why the Zohar, is a late book, is doctrinally unsound, theologically problematic, historically problematic, blah, blah, blah. And these points were made by various figures across the century. I just want to give you sort of the Rashby Prakim. And yeah, again, all this has been written by those better than me. And but it's worth knowing the story in its essentials. So as I said, towards the beginning of the segment, there were small signs in the 14th and 15th century of anti-Kabbalistic movements. So I mentioned the Shut of the Rivash, the statement by Yosef ibn Wakar. We mentioned the evidence of Zakuto the evidence of Isaac of Akko written in Sefer Yuchasin. We also must mention, however, the first major work that really attacked the Zohar as is was a book called Bechinat Hadat, written by a philosopher called Elijah Del Medigo, who was writing in the late 1400s. I believe he wrote this book in 1491. And really, it's a defense of Jewish philosophical rationalism. That's his main project. However, it is also an attack on the Zohar. It's the first. It's not such a thorough work, or at least it's not a thorough work in its attack of the Zohar. It only spends a relatively short amount of time on it, but it points out many of the problems in its doctrine and its theology, namely the whole notion of the theurgic efficacy of human actions, the idea that human beings can change the divine realm. It also mentions various other aspects which he finds difficult and problematic, and mentions to a certain degree a few of the historical anachronisms that he thought of as well, and comes to the conclusion it's a late book and mustn't be Miyuchas to Shimon Bar Yochai. So that's sort of a first shot. However, the first major, considerable historical treatment of the Zohar and historical argument against the Zohar took place in Venice in the 1630s. By one of the most extraordinary rabbis of the time, called, I'm forgetting his name, the author of the Ari Nohem.
Leon de Modena.
Thank you very much. Ari de Modena, Leon de Modena. It's just for context, anyone listening to this, it's 11:30 p.m. and I've already taught today, and like my brain is slightly in a whirl. Yes, I can't believe I forgot Modena's name. Yes, Leon de Modena. So fine. So he put together his book, the Ari Nohem, is quite a considerable. He was a rationalist, to a large degree a follower of Maimonides, but he saw Kabbalah encroaching in Italy very sharply in the 17th century. Again, post Arizal, post Tzfat, post Chaim Vital spreading various Lurianic doctrines in Italy, and he saw Kabbalah taking over in the hearts and minds of many of his students. He decided to write a historical work criticizing the Zohar, and bring up many of the historical points I made today. So the late all the various historical anachronisms and various mistakes in genealogy and misattributions and other such things. A lot of that comes up, and he really, I would say, made, let's say, 70 to 80% of the case against the Zohar was made by Leon de Modena in his book Ari Nohem. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating, 50 to 60%, but a very significant portion of the evidence brought up was already made by the Ari Nohem, and that's a very important work. However, Modena, as much as he repudiated the notion that the Zohar was written by Rashby, was an ancient text, he nonetheless quite liked the Zohar. He was charmed by the Zohar. He liked its aesthetics. He liked its poetry. And the truth is that this kind of sharply divides critics of the Zohar as well. Because some people read the Zohar and go, okay, listen, this might not be Rashby. Gosh, this is beautiful. And gosh, look at this language, look at this poetry, and look at these expressions, and look at these ideas, and how deep and how wonderful. And that's the sort of person that, I mean, he has criticisms of Zohar, to be sure, but he praises it. He thinks it's a beautiful instance of midrashic thinking. Okay? And so that's his position there. The next, and however, that sharply differentiates him from the work of Rabbi Jacob Emden, who I spoke about before. I'll talk about it a bit again. So this is the Mitpachat Sfarim. This is published in Altona in 1768. And Emden's position was, as I said before, he looked at the whole Zohar, and he found, and he enumerates in his Mitpachat Sfarim 282 instances where he believes that the Zohar is wrong. It's and sometimes makes dreadful mistakes, even heretical errors, or just poor grammar, or wildly implausible drashot on the psukim, etc., etc., etc. And he also is the first to mention the point with the nukudot and the ta'amim, with the cantillation marks and the vowels, and he makes quite a strong case again for the lateness of the Zohar. And also, unlike Modena, he very much was not charmed by the Zohar. In other words, he really, even though, as I said before, his introduction is a classic rabbinic introduction where he says how holy the Kabbalah is, and that there's a true core of the Zohar, which is from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and absolutely authentic and absolutely crucial. And he himself was a Kabbalist. He wrote treatises on Kabbalah. He was an extremely, really quite a brilliant and wide-ranging thinker. And also, he was, as I put it before, the first blogger, in the sense that he had a printing press in his basement, and basically everything he thought, he just wrote it up, printed it himself, and disseminated as much as he can. He was the first sort of popular writer in that sense. But he really made a very strong case against the Zohar. Then moving on historically, you have the period of the Haskalah. Now, the Haskalah, certainly the second, third generation of the Haskalah, they were very anti-Kabbalah, very anti the Zohar. However, they didn't phrase their objections in a systematic or in a scholarly way. Rather, their weapon of choice was satire. Right? They wrote, and it's quite common in Maskilic circles, they wrote very biting and very nasty satirical works. Essentially, let's say there's one famous one, I think it's Kinat Ha'emet, if I'm not mistaken, again, blanking on the name, but which throws a Kabbalistic rabbi into conversation with Moses Mendelssohn and with Rambam, and basically the Kabbalist being a figure of derision and a figure of absolute essentially turned into a laughingstock due to his beliefs in all these various irrational, outdated elements. And of course, for many members of the Haskalah who were trying to form a Jewish community which hewed to the criteria of a modern European enlightened form of religion, the Zohar was the ultimate enemy. It was the ultimate counterexample to enlightened, rational, progressive, forward-thinking, a type of Judaism, both because of its doctrines and also because, again, it's garbled Aramaic. Many of the Maskilim liked the purity of the Hebrew of the Bible and the purity of medieval poetry and all such things. They couldn't stand the Zohar, also because of its ideas, also because of its aesthetics. The one that I'm going to go through just the last couple of tachanot, the last couple of things that I want to mention, because just to give again the Rashi Prakim, the chapter headings of Kabbalah criticism. By the way, my forthcoming book, Introduction to Shadal's Vikuach, which I'll mention in a moment, has a large introduction in which I enumerate this history, a bit more thoroughly. I'm thinking of writing a whole book on the subject. It's a fascinating subject. But the next stage is Shadal, Shmuel David Luzzatto, who is again a maskil. His dates are 1800 to 1865, and in the year 1826 he pens a work called Vikuach al Chochmat Kabbalah, in which he places his own, in which essentially he places two figures, two literary figures, the oreach, the guest, and the mechaber, the author, the first person narrator. And the first person narrator is a staunch defender of rabbinic traditionalism, including the Zohar. And the oreach, who is a guest, who's a gentleman from Poland who comes in, is one of these a Maskilic archetype, let's say a stereotype of the Maskilic kind of thinker and expressor of ideas, and they have a 150-page long debate on the Kabbalah, on and specifically on Ba'al Kadmut HaZohar, and that's part of the title as well, whether the Zohar was in fact authentic, whether it was authoritative, whether it was in fact a book from antiquity. It's a fascinating debate, especially because, and this is one of the brilliance of Shadal's debates, Shadal's literary creations, is that the two sides are fairly evenly matched, right? It's not like the Kuzari or other debates where you have one figure who's clearly right and basically just the mouthpiece of the author and teaching the author. Shadal's Vikuach, his debate, pictures two very well-matched, very clever, very expressive defenders of their respective traditions and puts them in a clash with each other, right? Now, it's clear that Shadal's overall sympathies are with the anti-Kabbalistic tradition. That is true. However, he also marshals arguments there refuting or attempting to refute or attempting to provide counterpoints to the positions of the Maskilic guest, okay? And that's why, in my mind, that is, of all this anti-Kabbalistic tradition, this, to my mind, is the masterpiece. Better than the Ari Nohem and better than the Mipachat Sfarim, in the sense that it is also a sharp literary work where the points are bandied back and forth. It's true, much of what Shadal says is dependent upon the Ari Nohem and the Mipachat Sfarim of Modena and Emden, but his chidush, his innovations are really in the realm of nikud and nikudot and ta'amim, meaning the vowels and cantillation marks, and basically proving extremely thoroughly that the early grammarians, including Ibn Ezra and all the other, and Radak and all the others, and many of the Parshanim, did not presume the antiquity of the vowels and cantillation marks, knew that they were a later invention of the Anshe Tiveria, of the Anshe Masorah, and not from antiquity, and therefore, since the Zohar quotes it, the Zohar must always also be a late work. Okay, this is the main point of Shadal's work, and it is really quite a brilliant work, and I think it'll be also all the more brilliant when translated into English and accompanied with 1,100 footnotes. Please God, as we'll
very excited for that.
Yeah,
very excited.
Yes. And also, I think one that you haven't mentioned, I think, is Rav Kapach's fight against the Zohar.
Yes, I was going to get to that. The truth is that I haven't done so much research into that, mainly because my area of research is Europe focused and Europe based, and again, is that thing. So I'll admit that I don't know at the moment. So it's on my list of things to research. The final sort of tachana, the final element that I want to put in is the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement. Okay, the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement were the scholars 19th century Judaism, the first historians of Judaism, the first Jewish scholars, including Leopold Zuntz and Heinrich Gretz and Abraham Geiger and Zacharias Frankel and various others, who studied Judaism through the lens of historical criticism and philology and all the academic tools that enjoyed credence at the time in the German academia of its period. And they also studied the Kabbalah, and they were actually very proficient in it. There's a wonderful book by George Kohler of Bar-Ilan University, published recently, which goes through this period and it outlines how these scholars really did a lot of excellent research and founded the Kabbalah research. And basically, they all came to the conclusion: yes, the Zohar is a late book written by Moshe De Leon. At least that was the conclusion, mainly by Adolf Jelinek, who's the first great Kabbalah researcher in the 1850s. And so the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement. Now, some of them, as I mentioned, like Gretz and Steinschneider, were very hostile to the Kabbalah, but many of them weren't. And this is a very important thing to note. Actually, many of the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement figures had an element, including Abraham Geiger and including even Shadal to a certain extent and others, had an element of sympathy or an element of understanding what the Kabbalists were trying to do. Some of them saw it as how I tried to portray it right at the beginning of this podcast, as a kind of medieval philosophy, as a response to the common questions and common issues that philosophers and Kabbalists and every religious thinker had, and the creation of an extremely creative and literarily beautiful midrashic cosmos, which attempts to address these questions and build, formulate a notion or a depiction of Judaism, which allows for the dealing of these questions, or allows for answering of these questions. And that's the 19th century. The reason why I choose a bookend in the 19th century is because from that point onward, the Orthodox and non-Orthodox world, the Orthodox and the more Kabbalah skeptic worlds kind of divide themselves, right? There was a bit more of a spasm when Gershom Scholem published his book, and a couple of people, published some responses. And again, with the whole Kapach thing, the grandfather and the grandson, the various controversies there. But the truth is that after the 1870s, 1880s, there was a sharp distinction between the academic world and the mainstream Orthodox world, and therefore the debate sort of ceased. In other words, those who were convinced, it's a bit like nowadays. Nowadays, there isn't so much of a debate in the Jewish world regarding Kabbalah, in the sense that the vast portion of Orthodox Jews, I would say today, take it as read, that Kabbalah, the Zohar is written by Rashby, and the Kabbalah is an authentic and ancient part of Jewish beliefs, and that really is the secret mystical core of the Torah, and that is nowadays, I would say, largely a mainstream Orthodox belief. And there are those who are awakened or academically inclined Jews who know the historical evidence, have reached what I believe to be the correct historical conclusions. But there isn't so much debate, I would say, nowadays on topic, although it's coming a little bit back into fashion now. And maybe after this podcast, hits the waves, it'll suddenly explode and become a live subject once again. And therefore that's why I think that's the appropriate place to sort of put a kind of a full stop. But again, intellectual discussions come in and out of fashion. And who knows what we might see in the coming decades.
Yeah, I think it's been often met with violence, like you mentioned in the past. And in today's world, maybe there's like we might be met with some pitchforks, but we're starting a conversation that's very important. And I don't think anything like this conversation even exists online. So I really want to thank you for such a thorough analysis.
Fantastic. Really? Can I make a sort of a parting statement, which I think is germane? See, until now I've tried to be the historian, which is what I am, or at least aspiring to be. And please God, one day we'll even have the letters PhD after my name, with a bit of luck and a lot of persistence.
Amen.
However, there's something I want to say. Having said everything we've said so far today, which is as follows, which is that a large part of this debate turns on how the Zohar is treated. Okay, in other words, if one approaches the Zohar like one approaches any other work of Midrash, let's say the Midrash Rabbah or the Midrash Tehillim, and sees it as a work of, literary creativity with some good ideas sewn in and some, as a reservoir, as a source from which interesting ideas could be mined, then it's hard to object to that. Because the truth is, the Zohar is a wonderful example of medieval Midrash, a very, immensely creative, deeply well-informed. Those who wrote the Zohar really, really knew Chazal, really knew Midrash, really knew all of this stuff very well. And it is an excellent example of medieval Midrash. If that's how it's treated, it's difficult to object to it. It is an astonishing example of that genre. However, if it is treated like an authoritative Tannaitic work, whose theology is absolutely right, as it is stated, and whose halachic ideas are absolutely correct, and whose facts about statements about history and statements about genealogy and statements about the way the world is, both the human world and the divine world, and the Zohar is taken as absolutely authoritative, that becomes a problem. Because then the bibliographic question becomes very strong, and I think anyone who looks at the historical evidence has no choice but to come down on the side that the Zohar is in fact a late work, and therefore undermines the treating of the Zohar as an extremely important and centrally authoritative pillar of the Jewish religion. However, I think the Zohar belongs on our bookshelf. It's a fascinating reservoir of ideas, belongs on the shelf of medieval Midrash.
Of course, it definitely, if it stays in that place, I think that it's harmless, and I think that it's something maybe beneficial even in a way, but exactly. It hasn't stayed there. And the problem is that once it already kind of infiltrated every aspect of, or most aspects of Judaism today, if we pull out that thread from the whole tapestry kind of comes apart. And that's really the issue, because there's already Lurianic Kabbalah, there's already Hassidut, there's already all these ideas, and it does have an effect, because you have all of these kind of byproducts of that, which is the tzaddik and the whole thing about the Godhead being multiplex. These are all like fundamental problems that Maimonideans or traditional Sephardic or whatever you want to call it will always find this to be blasphemous.
I agree to that, and that is I wouldn't say tragedy, but that is the deep tension and problem that has arisen in the last few hundred years of Jewish intellectual history. Yeah.
Hakham Kimche, thank you so much.
2 hours and 45 minutes. I'm impressed with us, with all of us.
We might have to split this into 2 podcasts or something. Okay.
At your leisure. All this is now your material. Do with it what you will. Enjoy it.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
It's not easy to sit there for 2 hours and 45 minutes and give all the information like that. I mean, we really appreciate it. We hope that it serves to benefit all the listeners, and we wish you luck in all your endeavors.